I never imagined that leaving behind a life built on concrete and cubicles would lead me deep into the timeless embrace of the Oregon Cascades, where every droplet of rain and whisper of wind seemed to speak in ancient tongues. My name is Nathaniel Holloway. Friends call me Nate. And after years spent as a corporate engineer lost in endless spreadsheets and sterile boardrooms, I grew tired of the modern world's clamor. I craved something more elemental, more real. So I sold my apartment, quit my job, and purchased a small, weathered cabin near the Columbia River Gorge, convinced that the dense, mist-shrouded forests and rugged mountains would offer me solace, inspiration, and, perhaps, even a chance to rebuild who I once was. My arrival was a heady mix of excitement and quiet trepidation. I remember driving up the winding mountain road with its steep switchbacks, the landscape slowly revealing itself in layers of deep green firs and towering cedars. The air was crisp and smelled of pine resin and wet earth, so unlike the recycled air of the city. When I finally reached the cabin, a modest wooden structure with peeling siding and a sagging porch that had clearly weathered many storms, I felt as though I had stepped into another world, one where time moved at a gentler pace. I spent the first few days setting up the basics, rigging solar panels on the roof, connecting a rainwater collection system, and arranging my few treasured belongings in a small living area that doubled as my workshop and studio. Every detail was methodically planned, every bolt tightened with the hope that here, in nature's grand cathedral, I might find both refuge and renewal. At first, life was almost idyllic. I rose with the sun, its early rays filtering through the canopy and casting golden patterns on the forest floor. I took long walks along narrow, winding trails, breathing in the damp, cool air and listening to the gentle symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves. I felt invigorated by the simplicity of it all, the steady rhythm of nature replacing the frantic pace of urban existence. Yet, even in those early days of solitude, as I began to carve out a new identity in the wilderness, a faint unease tugged at the edges of my consciousness. It began with subtle anomalies that I initially dismissed as tricks of the light or the product of an overactive imagination. One cool evening, while checking the perimeter lights I'd installed around the cabin, I noticed a series of footprints in the soft, damp earth near the back door. They were irregular, yet unmistakably deliberate, as though someone, or something, had walked around my cabin after dark. The prints were not animalistic, yet they bore a human quality that sent an inexplicable shiver down my spine. I knelt to examine them closely. The footprints were deep, almost as if the walker had been burdened by great weight, and they circled the cabin in an odd pattern before vanishing into the dense undergrowth. I felt a mix of rational concern and an inexplicable dread that I couldn't quite articulate. In the days that followed, I began to hear things that defied my rational explanations. At night, as I lay in bed beneath a quilt I had picked up at a local thrift store, I would awaken to the sound of faint, indistinct whispers riding on the mountain wind. At first, I assumed they were merely the murmur of the trees or echoes of the wind twisting through the rocky crevices, but gradually the voices took on a distinctly deliberate cadence, a series of hushed utterances that seemed to call my name, to recite something in a language that felt both foreign and familiar. My nights became restless. I found myself sitting up in the dark, listening intently, heart pounding as I strained to catch the meaning behind the murmurs. In my early attempts to make sense of these occurrences, I turned to the few books on local lore I could find at a small library in a nearby town. I pored over texts on Native American legends, regional ghost stories, and the old tales of mountain spirits. I learned of a tradition that spoke of restless souls bound to the land, spirits that wandered the forests, trapped between worlds by ancient sorrows and unresolved histories. One story, in particular, recounted how a spirit, once a guardian of these very woods, had been wronged and left to wander, its voice a lament carried on the wind. I could not help but wonder if these spectral echoes were somehow connected to what I was experiencing. My rational mind, honed by years of engineering logic, battled with the growing realization that something beyond explanation was at work here. I decided to consult with an elder from a nearby community, a man known simply as Elijah, whose family had lived in the Cascades for generations. I recall our first meeting vividly. He was a lean, weathered figure with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the mountains. Sitting on a creaking porch at a small tea shop in a nearby town, I recounted my experiences in careful, measured detail. Elijah listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his gaze thoughtful and somber. When I finished, he spoke in a low, resonant voice. "The land here is alive, Nate. It remembers, and sometimes it speaks. There are forces older than our time that linger in these woods, and if you are sensitive, they will call out to you." His words, delivered with quiet authority, both reassured and unsettled me. He told me of rituals performed by his ancestors to honor and appease the restless spirits of the forest, practices passed down through generations as a way to maintain balance between the seen and unseen. Motivated by a desire to restore some measure of normalcy to my life and quell the disquiet that had settled in my bones, I agreed to join Elijah in performing a ritual cleansing near the cabin. One misty evening, under a heavy, overcast sky that promised rain, we ventured into a small clearing not far from my home. The ground was soft and damp underfoot, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and ancient bark. Elijah produced a bundle of sage and a small bowl of water from a weathered container, and with a measured deliberateness that contrasted sharply with my own nervous anticipation, he began to chant in a language that I could not understand. I watched as he moved slowly, his voice melding with the sound of the wind and the rustle of leaves. Together, we circled the perimeter of the clearing, sprinkling the water and allowing the fragrant smoke to rise into the cool air. For a time, it felt as though the very forest paused in reverence. The persistent whispers that had haunted my nights seemed to soften into a gentle hum, and a fragile peace settled over the clearing. In the weeks that followed the cleansing, I noted with cautious optimism that some of the disturbances had diminished. The eerie footprints became less frequent, and the whispers, while never entirely silenced, were quieter, as if the ritual had appeased a restless spirit rather than banish it entirely. Yet, even as I tried to embrace a sense of equilibrium, I could not shake the awareness that I was living in the heart of a realm where ancient forces still roamed free, a place where the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were as thin and fragile as a veil. Life in the Cascades gradually took on a new rhythm. I immersed myself in the daily tasks of maintaining my off-grid homestead, repairing the aging cabin, tending a small vegetable garden, and even learning to fish in the nearby river. Each activity, however mundane, was imbued with an underlying tension, a reminder that I was not entirely alone in these woods. I began to document my experiences in a leather-bound journal, a habit that quickly became both a therapeutic exercise and a meticulous record of the inexplicable. I wrote of nights when I would awake to the sound of my own name whispered on the wind, of mornings when dew sparkled on spider webs that seemed to be arranged in patterns I could not decipher, and of moments when a sudden, inexplicable chill would pass over me despite the mild summer air. As autumn deepened, the Cascades transformed into a palette of fiery reds, burnt oranges, and deep purples. The landscape became both breathtakingly beautiful and hauntingly somber, as if the very trees were mourning the passage of time. I spent long afternoons wandering among groves of ancient pines and cedars, sketching the interplay of light and shadow, my mind alternately filled with wonder and a persistent, nagging dread. I began to notice that the forest, in its silent majesty, seemed to be communicating with me. a language of rustling leaves, shifting mists, and the gentle creak of old wood. I found solace in these moments, even as they reminded me of the vast, inscrutable history that lay buried beneath the soil. Yet, no matter how much I tried to settle into this life of reflective solitude, the supernatural occurrences would sometimes break through like sudden, unwelcome intrusions. One particularly stormy night, as rain battered the cabin and lightning illuminated the dark, tumultuous sky, I sat huddled in the living room, trying to focus on a book. Suddenly, the power flickered, and the soft glow of my lantern cast elongated, dancing shadows on the walls. In that moment of half-light, I distinctly heard a voice, a mournful, sorrowful sound that rose above the howl of the wind. I froze, heart pounding as I strained to hear. The voice, or perhaps the echo of many voices, seemed to speak of loss, of centuries of grief embedded in the very stones of the forest. When the storm finally subsided, and the night returned to its quiet, steady rhythm, I was left with a lingering sense that I had glimpsed something profound and terrible, an ancient sorrow that had seeped into the fabric of the land. In the days that followed, I wrestled with the implications of my experiences. I had come here seeking refuge, a way to escape the mechanical pace of modern life and reconnect with nature's enduring beauty. Instead, I found myself confronting forces that defied the neat logic I had once relied upon. I began to accept that my off-grid life in the Cascades was not just about solitude and self-sufficiency. It was about coexisting with the unseen, acknowledging that the forest was a living repository of memories, both joyous and tragic. There were moments of profound clarity amid the darkness. Sitting on the porch at dusk, I'd watch as the sun sank behind the rugged peaks, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. In those moments, the forest seemed to breathe with a timeless rhythm, and I felt an overwhelming connection to something far larger than my own existence. I realized that the supernatural signs, the footprints, the whispers, the mournful voices, were not necessarily malevolent. They were echoes of an ancient world, a lingering presence of spirits who had once called this land home. I understood that to live here was to accept a dance between light and shadow, between the tangible and the ethereal. As winter slowly approached and the mists grew thicker, I fortified my cabin with protective charms, small totems carved from cedar, bundles of sage carefully hung by the door, and a circle of stones arranged outside the main entrance. These measures, recommended by Elijah and drawn from the traditions of those who had lived in these parts for centuries, gave me a semblance of control, even if only symbolic. I continued to record my experiences in the journal, noting that while the disturbances never entirely ceased, they became more predictable. A nightly chorus of soft murmurs, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, and fleeting glimpses of a figure that moved silently among the trees. I began to see these signs not as curses to be exorcised, but as a part of the natural order of this ancient place, a reminder that the land was alive with history, memory, and a quiet, persistent mystery. In time, I reached a turning point. The initial terror and unease that had accompanied my early nights in the forest gradually gave way to a respectful acceptance. I realized that my life here, with all its challenges, was a continuous negotiation with forces beyond my control. I learned to listen to the forest, to interpret the subtle cues in the rustling leaves and the shifting mists, and to live in harmony with the echoes of the past. The rituals and protective measures I had adopted became as natural a part of my routine as brewing morning coffee or tending the garden. I accepted that the supernatural presence was not something to be banished, but rather a part of the living tapestry of the Cascades, a presence that, though eerie, was inseparable from the beauty and mystery of the land. Now, as I sit here on a quiet, rain-soaked evening with my journal open and the steady patter of droplets against the cabin's wooden frame, I feel an enduring connection to this place. I am no longer the disillusioned corporate man who sought escape from the modern world. I have become a part of the ancient story of these mountains. I live in a delicate balance between reason and wonder, embracing both the scientific mind that built my off-grid sanctuary and the intuitive spirit that listens to the language of the forest. I have learned that life here is not about eliminating fear, but about understanding that fear is merely one of the many emotions woven into the fabric of existence. The footprints in the soft earth, the whispered voices on the wind, and the quiet presence that seems to linger in every shadow have become my silent companions, a reminder that some mysteries, no matter how unsettling, are part of what makes this world so profoundly alive. I have decided to remain on this land, not because I have fully unraveled every secret of the ancient forest, but because I have come to cherish the interplay of light and shadow, the interplay of the known and the unknown. I have fortified my cabin and my spirit, accepting that I will always be a guest in a realm that is as old as time. I look forward to each new day with a mixture of cautious anticipation and quiet awe, knowing that I am living in a place where every rustle, every whisper, every footprint is a message from a world that existed long before us. In embracing the mystery, I have discovered a deeper truth about myself, a truth that acknowledges that some of life's most profound experiences cannot be measured by logic or captured by data. They must be felt, lived, and accepted with an open heart. So here I remain, amid the misty peaks and ancient pines of the Oregon Cascades, a man transformed by his encounter with the inexplicable. My days are filled with both the tangible tasks of maintaining a homestead and the intangible wonder of listening to a land that remembers its own history in every whisper of wind. I have learned that the fear I once felt is now tempered by respect and curiosity, and that my life here is a continuous dialogue between what can be seen and what must be felt. In this delicate balance, I have found a home, not one defined by modern metrics of success, but one measured in moments of quiet revelation and the eternal dance of nature's secrets. I close my journal tonight with a sense of gratitude and a renewed acceptance of life's uncertainties. The Cascades have taught me that to live fully is to accept both the beauty and the terror of the world, and that in doing so, we find a deeper connection to the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of our understanding. I am Nathaniel Holloway, a man who sought refuge in the wilderness and discovered that the land, with all its ancient echoes and spectral whispers, is not merely a place to live. It is a living, breathing tapestry of memory, loss, and unyielding wonder. And so I remain, content to navigate the delicate dance between the seen and unseen, forever changed by the voices of the forest and the timeless spirit of the Cascades. I left behind a past filled with heartache and relentless memories of a breakup that had shattered my sense of self. My name is Elena Martinez, and I had spent years drowning my sorrows in the clamor of city life, a life that, despite its frenetic pace and constant noise, had never offered me the quiet solace I so desperately craved. After that painful split, I found myself standing at a crossroads, uncertain of who I was without the familiar chaos of urban existence. In a moment of both desperation and daring, I decided to start anew in the rolling hills of the Pennsylvania Poconos. I purchased a modest farmhouse nestled among ancient oaks and whispering pines, convinced that the gentle rhythm of rural life could help mend my fractured heart and rekindle a spark of hope. The farmhouse was an old structure with weathered clapboards and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot, yet it radiated a certain nostalgic charm. I spent my first days unpacking battered suitcases and relics of a former life, rearranging every room with an instinctive desire to create a sanctuary of healing and creative inspiration. Early mornings were spent watching the sun gently spill golden light over dew-draped fields, while evenings ushered in a quiet hush, punctuated only by the distant murmur of a nearby brook. I found comfort in these simple rituals, believing that nature's quiet cadence would soon help erase the painful echoes of my past. However, it wasn't long before I began to sense that there was something else lurking behind the farmhouse's rustic charm. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. One cool dusk, while I was settling on the porch with a steaming mug of chamomile tea, I first heard the faint sound of giggles, soft, almost childlike, and carried on the wind as if from another time. At first, I assumed it was merely a trick of my tired mind, or perhaps the laughter of local children playing somewhere unseen. But as the days slipped by, those giggles grew more insistent, and seemed to emanate from the dense woods that bordered my property. I would hear them when the sky was at its darkest, and the silence of the night seemed absolute. It was as if the very air was imbued with a mischievous, sorrowful mirth that I could not place. One evening, after returning from a long walk in the woods meant to clear my head, I discovered something that froze me in place. Near the edge of my porch, arranged neatly on the worn wooden steps, were several small hand-carved toys, tiny figures of animals and children that looked as though they had been fashioned with loving care. They were delicate, with intricate details and smooth, polished surfaces, and they appeared in places where I was certain I had not left any of my belongings. I picked one up, feeling its cool weight in my palm, and a chill ran down my spine. The toys exuded an eerie familiarity, as if they were tokens from a long-forgotten past rather than modern creations. I began to wonder if they might be remnants of a local tradition, or perhaps messages left by someone, or something, trying to communicate. As the strange occurrences multiplied, my initial hope for a peaceful retreat began to be overshadowed by a creeping sense of unease. I tried to maintain a routine, tending the small garden behind the farmhouse, walking along winding dirt roads, and reading old letters I had found tucked away in the farmhouse's dusty corners. Yet every quiet moment was tinged with the disquieting possibility that I was not as alone as I had thought. At night, the giggles returned with an almost rhythmic regularity, sometimes accompanied by soft whispers that I could not decipher. I started to wonder if these were the voices of weeping children, ghosts of a tragedy long past, rumored to haunt these very lands. Determined to find answers, I turned to the local community for insight. I visited the town's modest library and scoured local history books and newspaper archives. In faded pages and whispered recollections, I discovered vague accounts of a family tragedy that had occurred decades ago, a story of a young couple and their children who had perished in a mysterious fire that consumed a nearby homestead. The tale was murky and interwoven with local folklore, but there were hints that the children's laughter, once full of life, had turned into a mournful echo, a spectral lament that haunted the surrounding woods. The more I read, the more I felt that the farmhouse was somehow connected to this tragic past. I began to suspect that the giggles and the toys were not random occurrences, but manifestations of a lingering sorrow that had seeped into the land. I reached out to a local spiritual medium, a kind woman named Marjorie, who had earned a quiet reputation for her sensitive connection to the unseen. She invited me into her warmly lit parlor in the center of town, where shelves lined with weathered books and faded photographs created an atmosphere of gentle mystery. Over cups of herbal tea, I recounted my experiences with a trembling honesty, describing the childlike giggles, the mysterious toys, and the overall sense of being watched by a presence that was both playful and profoundly sad. Marjorie listened with sympathetic eyes, nodding slowly as if each of my words confirmed something she had long suspected. "Elena," she said softly, sometimes the land holds on to the memories of great sorrow. It is said that when a tragedy occurs, the spirits of those who were lost linger, not to harm, but to remind us of what once was, a call to remember, to grieve, and perhaps, in time, to heal. Her words resonated deep within me, stirring a blend of comfort and dread. She explained that these weeping children, as the locals called them, were not malevolent apparitions, but rather the echoes of lives cut short. Their laughter turned into an eternal lament that could sometimes be heard on quiet nights. Marjorie recommended a cleansing ritual, a way to honor the memories of those lost while also attempting to soothe the restless energy that pervaded my home. That evening, under a sky clouded with the promise of rain, I prepared a small altar on my porch. I arranged a few candles, placed a delicate vase of fresh wildflowers at its center, and laid out an old family photo I had found among the remnants of the farmhouse's past. With Marjorie's guidance, I recited gentle prayers and words of remembrance, asking for peace for the wandering spirits and for the restoration of calm in my life. As I spoke, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a momentary pause in the incessant giggles, as if the house itself were exhaling a sigh of relief. For that brief interlude, I dared to hope that perhaps the haunting presence would relent, that the ghosts of the past might finally find the closure they so desperately needed. But, as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the disturbances were not so easily exorcised. Even after the cleansing ritual, the faint giggles returned with the dusk, sometimes louder and more insistent than before. I would often find myself awake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, listening to the soft patter of footsteps outside my window and the distant sound of a lullaby that seemed to carry both joy and sorrow. The once hopeful promise of a fresh start had become entangled with an overwhelming sense of melancholy, a reminder that some wounds, no matter how much we try to heal them, never fully close. In an effort to reclaim a sense of normalcy, I threw myself into the daily rhythms of farmhouse life. I spent long afternoons tending to the garden, meticulously caring for each flower and vegetable as if it were a small miracle in itself. I took walks along the winding dirt roads, letting the crisp autumn air fill my lungs as I tried to focus on the beauty of the landscape rather than the eerie undercurrents that flowed beneath. I even began painting again, setting up a small easel by the window to capture the interplay of light and shadow on the rolling hills. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to immerse myself in the tangible tasks of daily life, the spectral disturbances continued to haunt my every step. One particularly dismal evening, as a cold wind swept through the Poconos and the sky was a brooding mass of dark clouds, I sat by the fire in the parlor, trying to lose myself in an old book. The silence of the night was suddenly broken by the unmistakable sound of childlike laughter echoing from the woods. It was a sound so pure, and yet so laced with sorrow that it sent shivers down my spine. I rose from my chair and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a small figure, barefoot, with a faded dress and a tear-streaked face, standing among the trees. The vision vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the echo of a laugh and the profound ache of loss. I could not shake the image from my mind. It haunted me with the certainty that I was sharing my home with remnants of a tragedy that refused to be forgotten. With every passing day, the presence of the weeping children grew more insistent. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary of hope and healing, seemed increasingly overtaken by a pervasive melancholy that I could neither ignore nor fully understand. I began to record these moments in a journal, each entry filled with my raw, unfiltered emotions. I wrote about the nights when the laughter would crescendo into a chorus of sorrow, about the inexplicable feeling of being enveloped by a deep, ancient grief, and about the tiny, hand-carved toys that continued to appear in places I least expected them. Each detail was etched into the pages, a testament to the invisible weight that pressed upon my soul. In the midst of this mounting unease, I reached a point where I had to confront the reality of my situation. I was no longer simply a woman seeking solace in nature. I had become a reluctant witness to a haunting that had roots far deeper than I could have ever imagined. I decided to hold another cleansing ritual, this time with the hope of not only appeasing the restless spirits, but also reclaiming a sense of control over my own life. I invited Marjorie back to the farmhouse, and together we set about creating an atmosphere of respectful remembrance. We lit candles and arranged fresh flowers in the same spot on the porch where we had performed the first ritual, and we recited prayers of both mourning and hope. As our voices blended with the sound of the wind, I felt a bittersweet mix of sorrow and relief, a small measure of peace that, for a time, seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. Yet, despite our best efforts, the supernatural occurrences did not fade away completely. The childlike giggles returned, sometimes with a playful quality that belied the underlying sadness, and the mysterious toys continued to appear as if left by unseen hands. I began to wonder if the ghosts of the past were not intent on harming me, but rather on communicating their own story, a story of loss, of a family torn apart by tragedy, of voices that had been silenced too soon and were now forced to linger in a world that had forgotten them. The more I thought about it, the more I felt a profound compassion for these spectral visitors. In the quiet solitude of the farmhouse, I realized that I was not alone in my suffering. These lost souls, too, were trapped in a cycle of grief from which neither time nor ritual could fully liberate them. As autumn deepened into a season of chill and change, I found that my own creative work began to reflect the duality of beauty and sorrow that defined my experience. My paintings and writings grew darker, more introspective, imbued with the silent echoes of laughter and tears that I had come to associate with my off-grid life. Every brush stroke and every word was a quiet conversation with the past, a tribute to the fleeting, fragile nature of life and memory. I even started to incorporate the mysterious toys into my art, arranging them in still-life compositions that spoke of innocence lost and time irrevocably broken. In this way, the haunting presence, while deeply unsettling, also became a muse, a source of creative inspiration that transformed my pain into art. But as the months passed, the constant reminder of the tragedy weighing on the land began to take its toll. I started to feel that the farmhouse, once a symbol of my new beginning, had become an inescapable repository for grief, a living monument to a sorrow that was not mine to bear alone. The laughter, though sometimes gentle, was always laced with an undercurrent of despair that made the nights feel interminable. I began to question whether I could ever truly find the peace I had sought here, or if I was destined to live in the perpetual shadow of a past tragedy that I had no power to change. Eventually, after many sleepless nights and tearful mornings, I reached a heartbreaking decision. I had come to the Pocono Mountains in search of healing, of a sanctuary where I could rebuild my life free from the painful memories of my breakup and the ceaseless din of urban existence. Instead, I found myself entangled with the sorrow of a family long lost and haunted by the echoes of unfulfilled dreams. The persistent, ghostly laughter and the inexplicable appearance of hand-carved toys served as constant reminders that some wounds run too deep, that some tragedies are too powerful to be appeased by gentle rituals alone. One chilly morning, as the first frost of winter began to lace the windows of the farmhouse, I packed my few belongings with a heavy heart. I took one last, lingering look at the old house, a house that had once seemed full of promise and possibility, but had gradually become a vessel for grief and spectral echoes. Standing on the porch, I listened to the soft, distant sound of laughter carried on the wind, a final, bittersweet farewell from the unseen children who had haunted these lands. I realized then that my time here, while transformative in ways I could scarcely articulate, had come to an end. The farmhouse had given me both solace and sorrow, a lesson in the fragile interplay between memory and loss that I would carry with me long after I left. I left the Pocono Mountains that day with a profound mix of relief and regret. In the safety of a bus station in a nearby town, as I waited for my ride back to a life that promised stability and routine, I found myself replaying the echoes of those ghostly giggles and the quiet murmur of voices in my mind. I knew that the haunting presence of those weeping children and the mystery of the small hand-carved toys would linger with me forever, a reminder that some parts of our past, whether our own or those of others, are indelibly imprinted on the land. My heart ached for the lost souls whose tragedy had woven itself into the fabric of that old farmhouse, and, for a time, I wished I could have done more to help them find peace. Now, as I sit in the relative hum of a bustling urban cafe, I find that I still carry the memories of that haunted farmhouse deep within me. I remember the soft light of early mornings, the bittersweet notes of ghostly laughter, and the quiet dignity of a legacy of sorrow that defied easy explanation. I have learned that healing is not a matter of simply escaping our own pain, but also of accepting that some mysteries are too vast and complex to be unraveled by human hands. The experience in the Poconos taught me that the boundaries between our world and the echoes of the past are thin and fragile, and that sometimes in seeking to mend our broken hearts, we find that we are called to honor the memories of those who have been lost along the way. I will forever cherish the lessons I learned during that time, the delicate balance between letting go and holding on, the beauty that can arise from tragedy, and the importance of empathy for the unseen sorrows that dwell in forgotten corners of our world. Though I eventually left the farmhouse behind, the spectral giggles and the tiny, mysterious toys remain imprinted on my soul, a reminder that every place carries its own story, every landscape its own secret. I am Elena Martinez, a woman who once sought refuge in the rolling hills of the Pocono Mountains, only to discover that sometimes the path to healing is lined with echoes of grief and the gentle, persistent whispers of the past. And though I have moved on to a new chapter in my life, I know that I will never truly forget the haunting beauty of that place, a beauty born of loss, memory, and the eternal resilience of the human spirit. I still remember the moment I decided that the clamor of the city had become too unbearable, a cacophony of flashing billboards, endless honking, and the relentless march of time measured by the tick of a clock. My name is Marcus Bennett, and I was once a man defined by the frantic pace of urban life, juggling deadlines and the constant pressure to perform. But after years of feeling like an automaton, my heart began to crave something different, a chance to find solace in nature, to rediscover a sense of purpose among towering trees and whispering winds. I sold my cramped apartment and left behind the neon glare of downtown, driving headlong into the unknown. My destination was a remote patch of wilderness in West Virginia, a promise of isolation, and a hope that I might finally reconnect with a deeper, quieter self. The journey itself was transformative. I drove along winding, dusty roads until the cityscape gave way to vast expanses of green, rolling hills, and rugged mountain silhouettes rising in the distance. As I neared the site I'd chosen for my new beginning, I was struck by the raw, untamed beauty of it all. I purchased a small, neglected parcel of land deep in the shadowy woods, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. I envisioned building a modest cabin there, a place where I could work with my hands, live off the grid, and let the solitude mend the worn-out edges of my soul. Building the cabin was an act of both defiance and hope. I spent long days hauling logs, raising rough-hewn beams, and learning to live by the rhythms of nature. My previous life had trained me to be methodical and disciplined, and I applied that same determination to constructing a home from scratch. I reveled in every moment of the work, feeling as though each nail hammered and board set in place was a step away from a life that had drained me, and a step toward something more authentic. The early days were filled with the satisfaction of sweat and timber, the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the quiet of the forest. I was alone, yes, but in a way that I found liberating, a chance to be utterly self-reliant. For a time, life was nearly idyllic. I woke with the sun filtering through the dense canopy of ancient oaks and hickories, and I spent my mornings exploring the labyrinth of dirt paths that wound through the wilderness. I set up a small garden, and by the time the first leaves of autumn began to change, I was harvesting vegetables and feeling a sense of accomplishment that no city job had ever given me. There was a freedom in the daily routine of chopping wood, tending to the small garden, and even repairing the off-grid power system I had painstakingly put together. I believed I had found a way to outrun the past and the relentless demands of modern life. Yet, beneath that sense of triumph, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not entirely alone out there. It started on a foggy morning. I had risen early, determined to enjoy the solitude and the crisp mountain air, and I set out on a walk along one of the lesser-known trails that skirted the edge of my property. The forest was shrouded in mist, the trees emerging like pale silhouettes against a soft, gray backdrop. As I moved deeper into the woods, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A colossal, shifting shadow that darted between the trunks. At first, I rationalized it as a trick of the fog or the erratic movement of a large animal, but the shape was neither fully defined nor entirely animalistic. It seemed to move with an almost sentient deliberateness, pausing briefly as if surveying the forest before vanishing into the thick haze. The encounter left me unsettled, a prickle of dread crawling along my skin that I could not easily dismiss. Over the next several weeks, the unsettling encounters became more frequent. I began to notice inexplicable tracks near the cabin, footprints that were too large for any animal I recognized, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. I installed a few security cameras, thinking that recording the phenomenon might offer a rational explanation. When I reviewed the footage, however, the images were blurry and indistinct, capturing only vague, ominous movements among the trees. At night, a persistent feeling of being watched would grip me, as though unseen eyes were constantly observing my every step. It wasn't just the shifting shadows or the mysterious tracks, it was an oppressive presence that seemed to seep from the very earth, filling the silence with a heavy, inexplicable dread. Desperate for answers, I turned to the locals, a rugged man known simply as Ray, a tracker with decades of experience roaming these parts, who seemed to know every whisper of the wilderness. Over a cup of bitter black coffee at a rundown diner on the outskirts of a small town, I asked him about the strange occurrences. Ray listened with a grave expression, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "These parts," he said slowly, "are older than most folks can imagine, and sometimes they're not so kind to strangers. There's an old tale, passed down through generations, about a Wendigo-like spirit that haunts these woods. They say it preys on the loneliness of those who come here looking to escape the world, feeding on fear and isolation." His words, rough and laced with the wisdom of the land, sent a chill through me. I'd heard legends in my childhood, stories of creatures that were part man, part monster, embodiments of ancient hunger and sorrow. I had never believed them until now. Ray's warnings were not enough to deter me from my quest for solitude, but they forced me to acknowledge that perhaps the peace I sought came at a price. My nights became increasingly fraught with anxiety, as the sense of being stalked grew ever more palpable. I'd lie in bed, the darkness pressing in around me, and listen to the soft rustle of leaves as if they were whispered warnings. The fog in the forest thickened, and the distant sound of an unidentifiable, almost mournful moan would occasionally ripple through the silence. I tried to convince myself that these were merely products of an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. Yet deep down, I knew that something was terribly amiss. One night, as autumn deepened and a heavy mist settled over the land, I experienced a confrontation that nearly broke me. I was awakened from a restless sleep by the sound of low, guttural murmurs echoing from outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened as the sound grew louder, swelling into an almost overwhelming chorus of eerie voices. It felt as though the forest itself had come alive with a malevolent intent. Gripped by terror, I fumbled for my flashlight and crept to the window. In the pale beam of light, I caught sight of a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, a hulking silhouette that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. For a few agonizing moments, the figure stood motionless, as if daring me to acknowledge its presence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it melted into the darkness, leaving behind only a lingering sense of despair and the unmistakable echo of its presence in my mind. That night marked a turning point. I was forced to confront the possibility that the legends were true, that some ancient, malevolent force lurked in the depths of these woods, drawn to the vulnerability of those seeking refuge from the modern world. My rational mind, trained to dismantle problems with logic and precision, struggled to contend with the overwhelming, primal fear that now coursed through my veins. I spent the following days reviewing the blurry images from my cameras, desperately searching for any sign that might explain the phenomenon. But every frame was a haze of indistinct shapes and shifting shadows, reinforcing the notion that I was in the grip of something beyond the realm of conventional explanation. In the weeks that followed, I attempted to carry on with the routines that had once filled me with hope. I returned to building and repairing my cabin, tending to my small garden, and trying to enjoy the majestic beauty of the West Virginia wilderness. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to immerse myself in the practical tasks of daily life, the presence of that ancient evil loomed ever larger. Every time I stepped outside, a prickling sensation of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I began to feel that my dream of a peaceful retreat was unraveling, consumed by a constant battle against forces I could neither control nor fully understand. The more the eerie phenomena escalated, the more I realized that my quest for solitude had turned into something akin to a relentless confrontation with the dark heart of the forest. I took to long, solitary walks, this time with a newfound wariness that bordered on dread. I tried to follow the tracks and patterns I had observed, hoping they might lead me to a rational explanation, or at least some insight into the nature of the entity that haunted these woods. One fog-laden morning, I ventured deeper than usual into a part of the forest I had never explored. The trees grew denser, their branches interlocking overhead to form a natural cathedral of shadows. As I walked, the oppressive silence was punctuated by the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional inexplicable rustle that made my heart pound in my chest. Then, in the midst of that surreal stillness, I heard it, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound was not quite human, and yet it carried a deep, sorrowful resonance that shook me to my core. I froze, straining to locate its source, but the sound dissipated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving me trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. I eventually returned to the cabin, a man burdened with a heavy, unspoken truth. I spent long evenings poring over the local legends and the accounts of other recluses who had ventured into these dark woods, each story a patchwork of ancient lore and whispered warnings. There was a recurring motif, a description of an entity, part man and part something else, that thrived on the isolation and fear of those who sought refuge in the wilderness. I began to suspect that my own struggle was a microcosm of something far older, a conflict between the modern world and the primordial forces that had always dwelt in the deep, wild places of the earth. The days turned into a blur of mounting anxiety and resigned determination. I realized that my dream of a tranquil, off-grid life was inextricably bound to forces that I could not escape. Every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye, every inexplicable sound that broke the silence of night, served as a constant reminder that I was not alone. The forest was alive with an energy that defied my understanding, and it seemed to gather strength with each passing day. I began to feel that the entity, this Wendigo-like presence, was not merely a passive observer, but an active participant in my existence. A dark, relentless force that fed on the isolation and fear I carried within me. One particularly harrowing night, when the fog was so thick it smothered the stars and the moon hid behind a veil of clouds, I reached a breaking point. I had just returned from a long day of work when I sensed, with an almost visceral clarity, that the entity was near. The air inside the cabin grew unnaturally cold, and a palpable tension pressed upon me as if the very walls were closing in. I sat in silence, straining to hear any sound that might betray the presence of the creature. Then, in the oppressive darkness, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone, a low, guttural growl, almost inhuman in its intensity, reverberating through the floorboards. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for the light switch, only to find that the entire cabin had been plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight. I could see nothing, but I felt the presence, as if it had surrounded me, creeping into every corner of my soul. I spent what felt like an eternity huddled in the far corner of the room, too terrified to move, until at last, as if satisfied with its silent watch, the oppressive weight began to recede. When I finally dared to turn on the light, I found myself trembling uncontrollably, my mind awash with images of that shadowy figure, its eyes, I was sure, burning with a malevolent intensity. In the aftermath of that night, I was forced to confront a truth I had long resisted. My dream of a quiet retreat had become a battleground, a constant struggle between the light of my renewed hope and the encroaching darkness of an ancient, relentless evil. I began to see that I could no longer ignore the possibility that the forest was not a benign sanctuary, but a living, breathing entity that harbored forces far older and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I wrestled with the decision of whether to fight on or to abandon the cabin altogether. Every logical part of me insisted that I had come here to escape the chaos of the modern world, not to engage in a battle against something that seemed straight out of a nightmare. Yet, the counter-argument was equally compelling. If I stayed, I might be forced to face a darkness that would consume me, a force that could shatter my fragile hope and rob me of any chance at renewal. After many sleepless nights filled with fevered dreams and a deepening sense of despair, I came to a painful conclusion. I realized that I could no longer call this place home. The forest, with its shifting shadows and eerie silence, had become a relentless reminder of a primordial horror that I was ill-equipped to face on a daily basis. The solitude that I had once craved was now a prison, each day marked by the constant presence of an unseen terror that made even the simplest task a battle against my own mounting fear. One cold, gray morning, with the fog still clinging to the treetops like a shroud, I packed my few belongings with a heavy heart. Every tool, every scrap of wood I had painstakingly gathered, seemed to whisper of a life that had once held promise and hope, now tarnished by the ceaseless torment of the dark woods. I took one last look at the cabin, a humble structure that had been my refuge and my battleground, and felt a profound sorrow for the dream that had been so cruelly unraveled by forces beyond my control. I drove away slowly, the winding road leading me back toward civilization, my eyes fixed on the receding silhouette of the forest. As I left the remote wilderness behind, I couldn't help but feel that I was abandoning not only my physical refuge, but also a part of myself, a part that had dared to dream of a life in harmony with nature, only to be confronted by the dark, inexorable forces that lurked in its depths. In the distance, I could still imagine the flicker of a shadow among the trees, the echo of that guttural growl resonating in my memory, a constant reminder that some nightmares are inescapable. Back in the city, amidst the neon lights and the relentless pace of urban life, I sometimes find myself pausing in the quiet moments between tasks, remembering the deep, oppressive silence of those West Virginia woods. I remember the taste of cold fear, the feeling of being utterly alone, even when surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness. I wonder if the darkness that haunted those woods still lingers, waiting for another weary soul to seek refuge in its depths. I still see the blurred, shifting shapes in my dreams, an endless reminder that the primal forces of nature are not always benign, and that some aspects of our world remain forever shrouded in mystery. I have come to understand that the dream of a peaceful, off-grid life is not as simple as it once seemed. The wilderness is a realm of contradictions, a place where breathtaking beauty coexists with an ancient, unyielding darkness that defies the neat explanations of science and reason. I learned that escaping the chaos of modern life sometimes leads one directly into the heart of nature's most unfathomable secrets, and that in seeking solitude, one may find oneself face to face with the primal terrors that lie hidden in the shadows of the forest. Now, as I sit in my small apartment in the city, surrounded by the familiar hum of urban life, I still carry the weight of that experience with me. I keep a small photograph of the cabin tucked away in a drawer, a silent memento of a time when I believed that nature would heal all wounds. Instead, I discovered that some wounds are carved into the very soul of the land, waiting for the day when another lost soul might wander too deep into the woods. I have learned that sometimes the only way to truly move forward is to accept that not every battle can be won, that some forces are beyond our control, and that the quest for peace must sometimes mean acknowledging defeat. I am Marcus Bennett, a man who once sought to escape the relentless pace of the modern world by embracing the wild solitude of West Virginia, only to find himself entangled in a struggle against an ancient, malevolent force that defied all reason. Though I left the cabin behind, I carry with me the haunting memories of those foggy mornings, the eerie tracks in the mud, and the inexplicable, shifting shadows that danced among the trees. They serve as a permanent reminder that the wilderness, for all its beauty, is also a place where the past never truly dies, and where the darkest parts of nature continue to linger long after the last light has faded. In the end, my experience taught me that sometimes the price of solitude is a constant, unrelenting battle against forces that are as old as time itself. And while I may have returned to a world defined by concrete and routine, I will never forget the chill of the mist in those dark, haunted woods, nor the knowledge that there are mysteries in this world that even the most resolute soul may never fully conquer. I never imagined that fleeing a corporate world of endless meetings and sterile boardrooms would lead me to a weathered off-grid cottage perched on the rugged cliffs of Mendocino, California. My name is Olivia Chen, and I once thrived in a life measured by deadlines and performance reviews, yet I always felt something vital was missing, a pulse of inspiration that could only be found in nature's raw embrace. When an opportunity arose to purchase a quaint, secluded cottage by the crashing Pacific, I left behind a career that drained my creative spirit in favor of the promise of endless sunrises over the ocean and the whisper of ancient pines. I envisioned days spent capturing the sublime interplay of light and water on canvas, of letting the natural beauty of the rugged coastline infuse my art with a truth that I had longed to express. Little did I know, this retreat would also open a door to a realm of mystery and melancholy that would alter my creative journey in ways I could never have foreseen. I arrived on a breezy autumn afternoon, the salty tang of the ocean air immediately mingling with the scent of eucalyptus and wild sage. The cottage itself was an old structure, modest and time-worn, with peeling white paint and a wraparound veranda that overlooked the stormy expanse of the Pacific. Even from a distance, it exuded a certain romantic decay, a beauty born of years battling the relentless coastal winds and salt spray. I remember the first time I stepped inside. I was greeted by creaking floorboards and narrow hallways lined with faded wallpaper, as if every surface held the echo of stories long past. I spent those initial days refurbishing the space in a way that honored its history, while infusing it with my own artistic sensibility. Every brushstroke on a wall, every carefully chosen piece of salvaged furniture, was a quiet act of reclamation, an effort to turn a relic of the past into my future haven. The first weeks were filled with the simple pleasures I had always craved. Long walks along windswept beaches, afternoons in the soft light of my newly arranged studio, and evenings listening to the rhythmic pounding of the surf against the rocks. My days followed a gentle, unhurried cadence. I would rise with the sun, brew a cup of herbal tea, and sit by the window as I watched the light transform the misty horizon into a canvas of fire and gold. I began painting immediately, eager to capture the raw, elemental beauty of the landscape. At first, everything seemed to fall into place. The crashing waves, the dramatic cliffs, even the windswept trees lent a palpable energy to my work. I felt as though I had found a wellspring of inspiration, a fresh start that promised both healing and creative renewal. But it wasn't long before I noticed something amiss. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world outside was hushed, and the only sound was the distant roar of the ocean, I began to sense subtle disturbances that defied easy explanation. One evening, after leaving a canvas set up in the open air to dry, I returned the next morning to find that the painting had changed. What I had left as a study in abstract blues and grays now bore faint, ghostly outlines, a figure, almost imperceptible at first, that seemed to hover over the turbulent sea. I assumed it was nothing more than a trick of the light or perhaps the result of my own fatigue blurring the details. Yet, over the following days, similar anomalies began to appear. I would wake to discover that objects in my studio, my easel, a stack of brushes, even a small bowl I'd carefully arranged on the windowsill, had shifted from their original positions, as if touched by an unseen hand. At first, I dismissed these occurrences as the capriciousness of an old house, settling into its own rhythms over decades of abandonment. But soon, the events grew too frequent and too deliberate to ignore. One night, I sat alone in my studio, the soft hum of the ocean as a backdrop to my solitary work. I was painting a seascape, trying to capture the raw energy of a storm gathering on the horizon, when I became aware of a presence behind me, a feeling, almost like a chill, that prickled at the back of my neck. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a stray cat or perhaps a trick of the shadows, but there was nothing there. Yet the sensation lingered, and for the rest of the night I felt as though unseen eyes watched me from the darkened corners of the room. Sleep eluded me, and my dreams were haunted by fleeting images of a woman in a long, tattered dress standing on the edge of the water, her face shrouded in sorrow and mystery. I awoke with a start, the echo of a distant, mournful cry still ringing in my ears, and a gnawing sense of unease settling into my chest. In the days that followed, I found myself questioning my own sanity. Was I simply tired, a victim of isolation and the pressure of a new beginning? Or was something far more inexplicable at work? Determined to find an answer, I began to delve into the local lore. I visited the small town near Mendocino, spending afternoons in a musty library and chatting with elderly residents who carried a wealth of stories passed down through generations. In hushed tones and with wary glances, they spoke of a legend, a tale of a gifted artist who had lived in these coastal lands centuries ago. According to the lore, she had been a visionary, renowned for her breathtaking paintings of the sea and sky. But a tragic love affair, marred by betrayal and heartache, had led to her untimely demise. In her final moments, she was said to have cursed the very land with her sorrow, leaving behind a spectral presence that manifested as shifting figures and whispered laments on stormy nights. Some locals believed that her restless spirit roamed the cliffs, seeking solace and perhaps even inspiration from those who dared to capture the beauty of the ocean in their own way. I felt a deep, unspoken connection to this tragic figure, an echo of my own struggles with loss and creative block. The idea that a spirit, burdened by heartbreak and a desperate need to be remembered, might be reaching out to me was both terrifying and strangely compelling. In the midst of my uncertainty, I found myself drawn to a local mystic known for her uncanny ability to communicate with the beyond. Her name was Celeste, and she lived in a ramshackle house on the edge of town, where the wild coastal winds seemed to carry secrets through its broken windows. I hesitantly reached out, and soon found myself sitting in her candlelit parlor, recounting the strange events that had begun to unravel my days. Celeste listened intently, her eyes soft with empathy, yet dark with the weight of things unseen. "You are not alone in your solitude, dear," she whispered, her voice a gentle caress against the chill of the room. "There is a muse here, a spirit whose sorrow has seeped into these walls, into the very fabric of this land. She seeks not to harm, but to be remembered, to inspire, to lament, to reach out from beyond." Her words resonated deeply, stirring emotions I had long kept at bay. Celeste suggested that perhaps I should try to communicate with this presence, to see if I could learn from her rather than fear her. The idea was both absurd and alluring. What if the ghostly apparitions were not a curse, but a muse that could elevate my art to heights I had only dreamed of? Emboldened by a mixture of fear and creative longing, I arranged for a séance. One cool, moonlit night, I gathered a few supplies. A simple Ouija board that Celeste had given me, some candles, and a few personal mementos that I felt might serve as a bridge between the realms of the living and the departed. I set up in the center of my studio, the only room with a clear view of the dark, star-punctured sky through a large, dusty window. I sat there alone, my heart pounding in anticipation as the candlelight flickered against the worn wood of the floor. I placed my trembling hand on the Ouija board, and in a voice that quivered between hope and dread, I asked, "Are you here? Who are you?" For long, agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then, as if in response to some silent summons, the planchette began to move slowly, its progress deliberate and measured. I watched in stunned silence as it spelled out a name, Isabella. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Could it be the spirit of the artist from the legend? The board continued, guiding me through a series of disjointed, halting messages. It spoke of love and betrayal, of art and anguish, of a life that had been cut short too soon. Each word seemed imbued with an indescribable sorrow, a longing to be understood and to create once more. I listened, mesmerized, as the spirit communicated in a language that transcended mere words, its message a tapestry of raw emotion and haunting beauty. The séance left me both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. In the days that followed, I found that the supernatural occurrences became less sporadic and more purposeful. My canvases, once blank or filled with tentative strokes of color, now seemed to come alive with ghostly images that I had not consciously painted. I would leave a canvas overnight, only to awaken to the faint, spectral outline of a figure, a woman with eyes full of sorrow, draped in a gown that seemed to flutter like the remnants of a long-lost era. I began to suspect that the spirit was not malevolent at all, but was, in fact, reaching out to share her story, to guide my brush and infuse my work with the depth of her experience. As the days turned into weeks, my art underwent a profound transformation. The once sterile landscapes and simplistic seascapes gave way to compositions rich with shadow and nuance, layered with subtle, almost imperceptible motifs that echoed the tragic legend of the vengeful artist. I found myself pouring my own grief and longing onto the canvas, and with each stroke I felt a sense of communion with the unseen muse. It was as if her presence had unlocked a reservoir of creative energy within me, a well of inspiration so deep that I could not help but be swept away by its force. My nights, once filled with dread, were now imbued with a strange, bittersweet hope. I would lie awake listening to the distant crashing of waves and the whisper of the wind through the pines, and sometimes I thought I heard her soft, almost melodic voice guiding my dreams. Yet, even as my art flourished, the boundary between the spectral and the tangible remained perilously thin. There were moments, fleeting and ephemeral, when I would catch a glimpse of the spirit standing at the edge of my vision, a figure draped in ghostly light, her eyes meeting mine with a sorrow that seemed to span centuries. Sometimes, while I painted, I would feel an unexpected warmth, as if an unseen hand were gently guiding my brush, ensuring that each color, each line, conveyed the depth of a loss that was not entirely my own. Other times, I would feel a cold pressure, a reminder that the connection between our worlds was fraught with both beauty and danger. I came to realize that my relationship with the ghost was as delicate as it was transformative, a dance of creation and despair, where every moment of inspiration was tinged with an inescapable melancholy. In time, the haunting presence became an inseparable part of my creative process. I learned to welcome her as a muse, even as I respected the boundaries between our realms. I began incorporating symbolic elements into my work, a recurring motif of a tear, the delicate impression of a long, flowing dress, the subtle silhouette of a woman with eyes full of unshed tears. My canvases became confessional, intimate windows into a world where art and sorrow merged into a single, unyielding force. I hosted small exhibitions at local galleries, and, to my astonishment, critics and fellow artists spoke of an otherworldly quality in my work, a mysterious, haunting beauty that defied easy categorization. Some said it was as if my paintings carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories, while others remarked on the ethereal quality of the colors, as if they were imbued with the very essence of moonlight and melancholy. Yet, despite the undeniable evolution of my art, a part of me remained haunted by the price of this newfound inspiration. There were nights when I would sit in my dimly lit studio, staring blankly at a half-finished canvas, and feel an overwhelming sense of isolation, a loneliness that came not just from physical solitude, but from the realization that I was now forever intertwined with a spirit whose sorrow was immeasurable. I began to question if I had unwittingly invited a fragment of tragedy into my very soul, if the spirit's presence was a double-edged sword that could both elevate and consume me. I wrestled with these thoughts in long, quiet moments, wondering if my quest for creative liberation had led me into a labyrinth from which there was no easy escape. As the months passed, I found that my life in Mendocino had become a study in contrasts, a fragile equilibrium between the tangible pleasures of a reawakened artistic spirit and the ever-present reminder of a past steeped in grief. I continued to hold seances every so often, not out of fear, but as a means of maintaining a dialogue with the muse who had so unexpectedly taken up residence in my heart. Each session was both cathartic and unsettling, as I sought to learn more about the spirit's tragic history, and in turn, uncover hidden facets of my own creative soul. I learned that the artist, whose name was lost to time but whose essence remained indelible, had been a woman of extraordinary talent and deep sensitivity, a soul who had poured her heart into her work until the weight of betrayal and unfulfilled love had driven her to her demise. In her final moments, it was said, she had vowed that her sorrow would live on, that she would forever be a part of the landscape, a spectral guide for those who dared to create with passion. In time, I began to embrace the notion that the spirit's influence was not a curse to be rid of, but a complex gift, a source of inspiration that demanded both reverence and caution. I grew to appreciate the moments when her presence felt like a gentle, guiding hand, rather than an overwhelming force. I realized that my art, infused with her spectral echoes, had the power to convey emotions that transcended the limitations of words, a silent dialogue between the realms of life and death, beauty and sorrow. I found that by acknowledging the spirit, by allowing her to be a part of my creative process, I was also acknowledging my own vulnerability, my own capacity for both pain and profound beauty. Now, as I sit in my modest studio overlooking the restless Pacific, I often reflect on the journey that brought me here. I remember the early days of hope and isolation, the gradual emergence of inexplicable disturbances, and the transformative, even terrifying encounter with a ghostly muse who reshaped my understanding of art and life. The off-grid existence that I once sought as an escape from the suffocating pressures of the modern world has become a deeply intimate exploration of the boundaries between the visible and the unseen. My canvases tell the story of that journey, of sunsets painted with both vibrant passion and quiet despair, of brush strokes that capture the fleeting beauty of a spectral whisper, and of colors that seem to shimmer with the light of 1,000 memories. There are moments when, late at night, I can still hear the faint, sorrowful echoes of her voice mingling with the sound of the crashing waves, a reminder that she is ever present, a part of this rugged landscape and, by extension, a part of me. I have come to accept that the creative process is often a melding of the earthly and the ethereal, a delicate balancing act between inspiration and the inexorable pull of the past. I choose to live with this duality, recognizing that my art and my life has been irrevocably enriched by the presence of that tragic, spectral muse. Though there are times when I wonder if I should have tried to banish the haunting, or if I have lost a piece of my soul in embracing it. I know now that I cannot unmake what has been woven into the fabric of my being. The ghostly figures that appear on my canvases, the inexplicable movement of objects in my cottage, and the soft, almost imperceptible murmur of voices on quiet nights are all part of a larger tapestry, a tapestry that tells the story of love, loss, and the enduring power of memory. I have learned that sometimes the most profound sources of inspiration come not from the absence of fear, but from the courageous acceptance of it. So I continue to paint, to write, to create in a space that is as much haunted as it is beautiful, a sanctuary where the ghost of a long-dead artist walks beside me, guiding my hand and infusing my work with a haunting melancholy that is as much a part of the landscape as the rugged cliffs and crashing waves. I have chosen to remain in Mendocino, not in spite of the spectral disturbances, but because of them, for they have opened my eyes to the intricate, sometimes painful, but ultimately transformative interplay between art and life. In this delicate dance of light and shadow, of presence and absence, I have found a truth that transcends the boundaries of time, a truth that whispers of the eternal connection between all souls, living or departed. I close my eyes now and breathe in the cool, salty air, feeling the timeless rhythm of the ocean and the distant murmur of forgotten voices. I am Olivia Chen, an artist forever changed by the spectral muse who graced my solitude, whose sorrow has become the quiet heartbeat of my work, In the melding of our stories, I have discovered that beauty and pain are not opposites to be vanquished, but harmonies to be embraced, a reminder that every brushstroke, every whispered note of inspiration is a tribute to the enduring legacy of a life that, though lost, continues to live on in art and memory. I remember the day I decided I couldn't bear looking at the empty walls of my old home any longer. Walls once filled with photographs of happier times, now stripped bare, mocking me with their silence. My name is Caleb Thompson, and for years I'd tried to piece together a life that should have made me happy. A comfortable house, a steady job, and a marriage that, on the surface, seemed stable. But all it took was a single, shattering conversation to realize that the life I'd built was crumbling beneath my feet. The divorce left me feeling like a stranger in my own skin, questioning everything I'd once held dear. Rather than linger in the echo of what was lost, I sought a raw, unfiltered existence, something that would force me to confront my pain and perhaps rebuild myself from the ground up. That's how I found myself in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, a region with a rugged beauty unlike anything I'd known in my suburban life. I bought a few acres of untamed land, far from any paved roads or neatly trimmed lawns, and I told myself this was my chance to prove I could stand on my own. I spent most of my savings on a modest prefab cabin that arrived in sections, which I assembled with the help of a solitary neighbor, Jimmy, who lived a mile or two down the winding dirt track. We worked in the relentless summer heat, sweating under the sun until each piece of the cabin fit together with a satisfying click. At first, it was a balm to my spirit. No more city noise, no more stifling reminders of my old life, just the serene hush of the mountains and the ruffle of wind through pines. In the beginning, the days were filled with a simple, grounded pleasure. I'd wake at dawn to the chorus of birdsong, a warm mug of coffee in hand, marveling at how quickly the sun rose over the ridges. The air smelled of pine needles and wet earth, and I felt a twinge of gratitude for each breath of it. I set up a small garden to grow vegetables, tilled a patch of ground behind the cabin, and built rough fencing for a few goats and chickens I acquired soon after. My dream was to live off the land, to rely on nothing but my own sweat and the generosity of nature. For a while, it seemed as though everything was falling into place. My goats were gentle and curious. The chickens laid eggs almost daily, and I often sat in a worn rocking chair on the porch, gazing at the starlit sky, thinking that maybe I'd finally outrun my ghosts. But it wasn't long before an undercurrent of unease began to ripple through my so-called paradise. It started innocently enough. The goats became restless at dusk, huddling together in their pen rather than grazing as they usually did. At first, I chalked it up to normal skittishness, perhaps the presence of a coyote lurking nearby. Then, on a sweltering August evening, I heard the first of the sounds that would come to plague my nights. I was out by the goat pen, checking the fencing for any gaps, when I caught a deep, guttural moan echoing through the trees. It was neither fully human nor animal, a resonant sound that rumbled through the evening air and set every hair on my neck standing upright. The goats heard it too. They froze in place, ears perked, eyes wide, as though confirming the primal fear that pulsed through my veins. I tried to reason it away. Maybe it was just the wind funneling through a rock crevice, or a black bear rummaging further up the mountain. I told myself that living off-grid meant learning to coexist with the wildlife, even the kinds that sent chills up your spine. But over the next few nights, the noises persisted. Sometimes I heard them in the late hours, reverberating through the dense woods just beyond the faint glow of my porch light. Other times, just before dawn, I'd awaken with my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something hulking and massive trampling near the cabin. Occasionally, I swore I caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, shadows that flickered at the edge of my vision, dissolving the moment I turned my head. I began to lose sleep. My carefree routine of early mornings and gentle tasks was replaced by a creeping apprehension. I noticed that the chickens, too, seemed unsettled, clucking and rustling about nervously whenever the sun slid below the horizon. My once peaceful goats were prone to violent spurts of panic that left them trembling. The more I tried to dismiss my fears, the more the nights conspired to remind me that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the moans and rustles. There was a feeling in the air, a tension that built at twilight and lingered like a half-forgotten secret whispering in the dark. After a particularly restless week, I decided to seek answers. I drove my dusty pickup down the winding road to the nearest town, a small collection of buildings clustered around a single blinking traffic light. In the local diner, I struck up conversation with a few folks about the eerie noises in the mountains. Most gave me polite shrugs, attributing it to wildlife or the imagination of a newcomer not used to backcountry life. But one older man, hunched over a cup of black coffee, listened with a furrowed brow. He introduced himself as Bert, a local folklorist of sorts, though he didn't use that term exactly. His interest was piqued the moment I mentioned the unearthly moans and the animals' skittish behavior. Over the low hum of the diner's ceiling fans, Bert told me of an old legend in these parts, tales passed down for generations about a witch's curse laid upon a swath of land in the Ouachitas. Supposedly, centuries ago, a woman was wronged by settlers, accused of witchcraft, and left to die in the very forests that now cradled my homestead. In her final moments, so the stories went, she cursed the land, vowing that all who came to live there would feel the weight of her wrath. Some folks dismissed it as campfire lore or a cautionary yarn, but every so often a new story emerged. Crops failing without cause, livestock vanishing, unexplainable apparitions in the woods. Bert claimed that he had devoted years to piecing together these stories, and while he wasn't sure whether to believe them fully, he couldn't ignore the consistency in their details. I left the diner with a knot in my stomach and Bert's phone number scribbled on a napkin, the promise that he would visit my homestead soon to see if he could help shed some light on the disturbances. Part of me felt foolish for entertaining the notion of a curse, yet the rational explanations continued to elude me. The next day, Bert arrived in his battered old truck, stepping out with a solemn expression and a tattered notebook under his arm. He asked me to show him around, so I led him through the small goat pen, the chicken coop, the perimeter of my property, where the pines pressed in close. Everywhere we went, I felt the hush of the forest intensify, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were fixed upon us. I demonstrated the spots where I'd seen footprints in the soft earth, prints too large and misshapen to be a bear's, yet not entirely human either. Bert examined them quietly, noting the depth and the odd spacing between each track. He flipped through his notebook, murmuring references to local tales, accounts of a shadow figure that roamed the night, accompanied by guttural growls and the stench of decay. The stench, that was another thing. I realized I had occasionally caught a foul odor in the dead of night, rancid and sulfuric, though fleeting enough that I'd assumed it was just the goats or a skunk passing by. As evening approached, Bert and I sat on the porch, cradling mugs of tea and watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the mountain ridge. The sense of anticipation was palpable, like we were both expecting something to emerge the moment darkness fell. We didn't have to wait long. Not long after twilight descended, the woods seemed to bristle with tension. A cold, subtle breeze came out of nowhere, carrying that faintly rotten odor, and then we heard it, a low, keening moan that echoed among the pines. My stomach twisted. Bert's face turned grim. It was one thing to hear the stories in the safety of a diner, quite another to feel them crawling under your skin in real time. It was then that Bert mentioned he had a plan, though he was unsure if it would help. He believed we might need to perform a form of counter-curse ritual, an attempt to purify the land and ask the wronged spirit to move on. It was risky, he said. The old stories suggested that once the curse became active, any attempt to interfere could provoke a violent response. But after seeing my goat's panicked eyes and hearing the unmistakable horror echoing in the woods, I decided I couldn't keep living in this suspended terror. I agreed to the ritual, a mixture of desperation and a faint hope that maybe we could bring peace to this haunted soil. We spent the following day gathering what Bert claimed we needed for the ritual: herbs like sage, rosemary, and a handful of local plants he believed had protective properties. A few symbolic items from my personal life, a framed photo from my old life, a small piece of jewelry from my mother, to represent my connection to the land and my intention to rebuild. Bert also insisted on collecting soil from the four corners of my property, which he mixed in a wooden bowl with salt and ashes. At dusk, we assembled these items at a small clearing behind the cabin, a place circled by tall oaks that seemed older than any living memory. The ceremony began under a sky streaked with the last oranges of sunset, quickly fading into a purple twilight. Bert lit a fire at the center of the clearing, and as the flames leapt and crackled, he sprinkled the herbal mixture into the fire, releasing an aromatic smoke that curled upward in ghostly spirals. We arranged the personal items around the flames, each representing an aspect of my life that I wished to protect or release. Bert began chanting softly, words I didn't fully understand, but which carried an ancient, solemn cadence. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched the shadows lengthen, a primal fear gnawing at me with every passing second. At first, the ritual felt oddly comforting. The crackling fire, the glow of embers, Bert's steady voice. It was as though we were participants in a timeless act of communion with the land. But as we neared the end, the atmosphere shifted violently. An icy gust of wind whipped through the clearing, causing the flames to dance erratically. The sweet, herbal scent of the smoke turned harsh, acrid, almost burning my nostrils. Bert faltered in his chanting, his eyes darting toward the looming tree line. We heard it then, a roar like nothing I'd ever encountered, a guttural snarl that resonated with an inhuman fury. It was close, too close. The goats in their pen let out terrified bleats, the sound carrying across the clearing in a frantic plea for help. My blood turned to ice. I glanced at Bert, whose face had gone pale, his chant dying on his lips. The night seemed to explode with movement at the edges of our vision, branches snapping, leaves rustling in a frenzy, as if something colossal charged through the forest. Everything happened in a blur. The fire guttered, flared, then nearly died, sending sparks spiraling into the blackness. I fumbled for a flashlight or any source of illumination, but the darkness was too thick, too alive with menace. Bert hastily finished what he could of the ritual, tossing the final handful of salt and ashes into the flames. In the flickering glow, I saw a shape, large, hunched, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My throat closed in terror as I registered eyes gleaming with an unholy glow, locked on us with an intensity that drained every thought from my mind. Bert shouted something I couldn't parse, an invocation or a warning. Then a violent rustling tore through the undergrowth, as if the presence was thrashing against the boundary we'd attempted to set. I don't recall exactly how we made it back to the cabin. My memory is a haze of panting breaths, the pounding in my ears, and the adrenaline that propelled me forward. All I know is that I found myself inside, barricading the door while Bert hurriedly doused the lanterns, as if plunging the cabin into darkness might hide us from the wrath prowling outside. For what felt like hours, we huddled in the gloom, listening to the terrifying cacophony of snarls and growls, the frantic bleating of goats, and the oppressive sense that something monstrous circled the cabin. Every so often, I heard the scraping of claws, or were they nails, against the walls, and my heart threatened to burst with the knowledge that we were powerless if it decided to push inside. When dawn finally broke, the forest returned to a semblance of its ordinary self, though the lingering tension was palpable. Bert and I ventured out cautiously. The clearing looked ravaged, with branches broken and the remains of our ritual scattered. My goats were trembling in their pen, their eyes wide and glassy. One chicken had gone missing altogether, with feathers strewn across the dirt. The silence of the morning felt unnatural, as if the land held its breath, unsure whether the threat had truly passed. Bert shook his head. Lines of worry etched into his face. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Whatever is out here, it's not done. Our ritual might have made it angry." A cold dread seeped into my bones. The counter-curse had failed, or worse, it had antagonized the very force we'd hoped to appease. In the days that followed, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, repairing what was broken and caring for my traumatized goats. But every time dusk arrived, the atmosphere grew oppressive, charged with a latent hostility that kept me on edge. The guttural noises in the woods continued, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. I rarely slept, jolting awake at the faintest sound, terrified that the monstrous presence might tear down the door and end this nightmare in bloodshed. I tried to keep hope alive, telling myself that we'd just had one bad night, that maybe things would settle. Yet, deep in my heart, I knew that the land itself was gripped by a malevolent energy older than any feud or personal heartbreak. One evening, as I stood on the porch with a shotgun in hand, scanning the tree line for movement, it struck me that I could not keep living like this. The dream of solitude and self-reliance had become a prison of perpetual fear, each sunrise bringing fleeting relief that vanished with the first shadows of twilight. I realized then that the heartbreak I had tried to escape by moving here, the divorce, the sense of personal failure, was nothing compared to the horror of feeling hunted on my own land. The witch's curse or whatever ancient force prowled these woods was beyond my ability to conquer. My presence in the Wachitas had awakened a wrath, or perhaps I'd simply stumbled into an ongoing legacy of dark magic. Either way, it was time to go. The decision was agonizing, yet inevitable. I spent the next day packing my meager belongings, ignoring the pangs of loss that welled up every time I glanced at the half-finished garden or the roughly built goat pen. I found homes for my goats and chickens with a neighbor further down the valley who was less affected by the phenomena. They seemed sympathetic, if somewhat baffled by my urgency. Bert helped me load my pickup, his eyes heavy with regret. "I wish we'd been able to set things right," he said, placing a rough hand on my shoulder. I managed a faint smile, grateful for his efforts, but aware that our attempts had only scratched the surface of a mystery older and darker than either of us could fathom. I left the Wachitas with the sun sinking behind me, the dusty road stretching out like a path to some uncertain future. In my rearview mirror, I watched the forest recede into shadow, haunted by the knowledge that a malignant force still lurked within those ancient hills. A sorrow clung to me, a sense of unfinished business, of a dream left in tatters. The heartbreak of my divorce had driven me into the wilderness, and, ironically, it was heartbreak of another kind, a heartbreak in the very soul of the land, that drove me away. Time has passed since then, and I've found temporary refuge in a small rental on the outskirts of a larger town, where electric lights and the hum of passing cars offer a strange form of comfort. I still wake up some nights, convinced I hear the echo of those guttural moans or the frantic bleating of goats lost to the dark. I've tried to move on, but the memory of that place, the heavy hush of the pines, the rustle of dead leaves underfoot, the stinging realization that some curses are as real as the ground we tread, lingers in my mind. I sometimes wonder if the haunting presence still prowls the perimeter of my abandoned cabin, waiting for the next unwitting soul to settle there, blissfully unaware of the centuries-old wrath that poisons the very soil. I've come to accept that my search for solace in the Ouachitas was doomed from the start, that no amount of determination or longing could stand against an ancient malevolence festering in the roots of the mountains. Perhaps the real lesson is that healing can't be forced by running away, that there are terrors in the world far more potent than personal heartbreak. Wherever I end up, I carry the memory of those nights in the wilderness, when the line between the physical and the supernatural blurred, and I realized how fragile we truly are when faced with the unknown. I am Caleb Thompson, a man forever changed by the sound of guttural moans in the dark, by the knowledge that curses might be more than just stories, and by the humbling acceptance that some forces cannot be tamed by human hands. I left the Ouachitas with a battered spirit, but alive, and for that, at least, I am grateful. I can only hope that the witch's sorrow finds rest someday, and that the land she once cursed might eventually heal in the absence of mortal dreams. I left behind a life that had grown far too loud for my heart to bear, a bustling city, a stressful job, and an endless barrage of noise that offered no room for reflection. My name is Samantha Rivers, though I usually go by Sam, and I had spent much of my 20s navigating the concrete confines of urban life, working in a crowded office where each day felt like a race against time. At first, I believed that this was simply the way things were supposed to be, yet the older I got, the more I realized how deeply I craved the quiet. I dreamt of days spent writing by a sunlit window, free from the pressure of deadlines and the ceaseless hum of traffic below. That's how I found myself here, in a small, weather-beaten cabin perched on a gentle slope in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. It wasn't much to look at, a single-story structure with chipped paint and a sloping porch that offered views of rolling hills beyond, but it felt like a refuge from the world I'd left behind. I bought the place with the last of my savings, packed my few possessions, and drove through winding roads and sleepy towns until I arrived one crisp afternoon. The air was cooler than I was used to, and I stood on the porch, watching the golden light of dusk spill over the distant peaks. In that moment, I promised myself that I would finally learn to slow down, to listen to the hush of the wind through the pines, and let the quiet feed my soul. I won't deny that the first few weeks were indeed peaceful. Mornings began with the soft glow of dawn trickling into my small bedroom. I'd wake to the sound of birds greeting the day, brew a pot of tea, and step onto the porch to watch the valley awaken. There was a primal simplicity to it. No alarms blaring, no commuter trains roaring past, just the gentle rustle of leaves, and the occasional deer slipping through tall grasses. During those early mornings, I felt that I'd made the right choice. I'd sit outside with my mug in hand, notebook and pen at my side, jotting down fleeting impressions or half-formed ideas for short stories and poems I'd always wanted time to write. As the days drifted by, I began to organize my new life. I set up a tiny study in the back room, where a single window overlooked a slope of ferns and wildflowers. I took long walks through the woods that bordered my property, relishing the scent of damp earth and the distant trickle of a small stream I discovered. Occasionally, I'd spot an old stone wall or a dilapidated fence post, a reminder that people had once worked these lands long before me, carving their stories into the soil. At night, I often sat by an old fireplace in the living room, reading until my eyes grew heavy, or sometimes just staring at the embers and thinking about how far I'd come from the city. Despite the cabin's state of mild disrepair, there was a comforting warmth to it. The floorboards creaked as I walked from room to room, and the walls carried a faint scent of cedar and time-worn dust. I stumbled across an old bookshelf left behind by the previous owner, filled with a strange assortment of novels, travel guides, and local histories. One volume in particular caught my eye, a slim, aging book titled Ghosts of the Berkshires. its spine cracked and yellowed pages exuding the musty odor of long-forgotten tales. I flipped through it out of curiosity, intrigued by the notion that these peaceful hills might harbor echoes of a more haunted past. The stories ranged from rumored sightings of spectral lights in deep forests to the restless ghosts of old inns that had burned down centuries ago. I smirked, half in amusement, half in fascination, wondering whether these legends were simply the product of overactive imaginations. But soon, the quiet routine I'd established began to show subtle fractures. One morning, as I was tidying up the living room, I noticed something wedged beneath a loose floorboard near the old fireplace. Curiosity piqued. I pried it open and discovered a bundle of letters, aged parchment, tied together with a faded piece of ribbon. My breath caught when I realized how delicate they were. The edges were crumbling, and the handwriting on the envelopes looked old-fashioned, with sweeping flourishes and an ink that had long since faded to a soft brown. Each envelope bore no stamp, as if they'd never been mailed, only addressed in a spidery hand to a certain Eleanor H., with no surname or formal address. I set the letters on a small wooden table, carefully untying the ribbon and unfolding the first. The paper crackled in protest, as though it had been asleep for decades. My eyes skimmed the lines, trying to make sense of the archaic language. It was a love letter, penned from someone named Charles, his words brimming with longing and regret. He wrote of meeting Eleanor in a secret glen, of stolen moments beneath moonlight, and of some nameless misfortune that had driven them apart. Intrigued and slightly unsettled, I read through the remaining letters. Their contents painted a picture of a tragic, forbidden romance. Star-crossed lovers whose families were sworn enemies, or whose circumstances forbade them to be together. The more I read, the deeper I fell under the letter's melancholic spell. There was talk of arranged marriages, of desperate vows to elope, of heartbreak that Charles feared would haunt him forever. In one letter, dated well over a century ago, he wrote, "My dearest Eleanor, I am consumed by the hush of these hills, for it is in their silence that I hear your laughter echoing in my memories. If only we could shape our own destiny. I fear my heart will never leave this place, doomed to wander the forests where we once strolled hand in hand." A chill swept through me as I read those words. Somehow, in their quiet sorrow, they resonated with my own quest for solitude and healing. I felt a kinship with these long-dead lovers, trapped by circumstances beyond their control, searching for a peace that seemed eternally elusive. From that day onward, the cabin's air felt charged with a new kind of electricity. It wasn't entirely frightening, but it was unsettling, like walking into a room where someone else had just been having an emotional conversation. I began to notice fleeting sounds at odd hours, a gentle sob muffled by walls, or a whisper that vanished as soon as I turned my head. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, reading heartbreakingly intimate letters from the past could stir up emotions, especially in a place that was otherwise so silent. Yet, night after night, I found it harder to sleep. I'd lie in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, straining to detect the faintest noise. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps pacing the hallway, each step slow and deliberate. Other times, I felt a soft brush of cold air against my cheek, as if someone were leaning over me, sighing with unspoken sorrow. One afternoon, seeking answers to the knot of questions tangling in my mind, I drove into town and visited the local archives. The building was unassuming, a converted storefront with a modest sign reading Historical Society. Inside, rows of filing cabinets and cramped shelves contained records dating back centuries. I approached the archivist, a kind, elderly woman named Diane, and asked if she knew anything about local stories of a romance that had ended tragically in these hills. She studied me with curious eyes, then motioned for me to follow her to a back room stacked with dusty ledgers. There, she produced a ledger of births, deaths and property transactions from the late 1800s. After some searching, she pointed to a listing for a Charles W. and an Eleanor H., marked with a short note, disappeared under mysterious circumstances, presumed lost in the winter of 1882. A hush fell over the cramped space, and I felt a shiver skitter along my spine. So these were the same two souls who had penned the letters I found. According to Diane, local legend claimed they had tried to run away together one stormy night, only to vanish before they could reach the main road. Some said they drowned crossing a swollen creek, while others believed they had been caught by one family or the other and spirited away in shame. No one knew for sure. Their fate remained a mystery that had faded into half-remembered gossip and ghost stories. The archivist frowned sympathetically, explaining that the region had its fair share of legends, but the story of Charles and Eleanor remained one of the sadder, more romantic ones. I drove back to the cabin with a mixture of dread and resolve swirling in my thoughts. I couldn't shake the sense that I had trespassed upon a grief that was not mine, awakening echoes of a sorrow left unresolved. Perhaps the faint sobs and whispers I heard in the night were the remnants of their longing, still bound to these hills, searching for the closure they never received in life. I spent long hours by the fireplace, turning this over in my mind, my creative instincts stirring. I was no stranger to writing stories or poems about heartbreak, but this was different. It was raw, immediate, as if the ghosts of Charles and Eleanor beckoned for their tragedy to be acknowledged, not just consigned to a box of letters hidden beneath a floorboard. It was then I decided that I needed to do something. A fleeting notion took shape. What if I held a memorial for them? A small, intimate ceremony that might grant these long-departed lovers a measure of peace. The idea was both impulsive and deeply heartfelt. I planned it in the simplest possible way. I'd read the letters aloud near the place where I found them, then bury them in the earth under a small cairn. Perhaps the act of speaking their story aloud, of naming their loss and acknowledging their love, would ease the tension that clung to the cabin. The next day, I posted a modest notice in town, inviting anyone who cared to attend. I wasn't sure if any locals would bother, but I felt it was right to share this moment, to release the sorrow of Charles and Eleanor into the wider community. When the day arrived, an overcast afternoon where the sun glowed wanly behind thick clouds, I was surprised to see half a dozen people gathered near my cabin. There was Diane from the archives, who gave me a warm nod, a couple of curious neighbors who had heard whispers of my plan, and even the local pastor, who held a small Bible gently in her hands, an expression of thoughtful respect on her face. We formed a circle behind the cabin, near a circle of mossy stones that looked like they had once been a gathering place for something old and sacred. The letters, carefully restored as much as I could, rested in a small wooden box I had found in the attic. Standing among the pines, the wind ruffling my hair, I read passages from the letters aloud, stumbling at times over archaic words but pushing through, determined to let their story breathe once more. My voice trembled as I read their final lines, recounting vows of undying devotion and the heartbreak they carried into the unknown. The air seemed to thicken with emotion, as if every rustling leaf bore witness to a grief that had spanned centuries. After the readings, the pastor said a few words, her voice gentle, asking for rest for all souls who roam these hills in search of peace. We then buried the letters in a shallow trench beneath one of the moss-covered stones, marking the spot with a cairn of river rocks we'd gathered from the nearby stream. A hush followed, as though the forest itself paused in reverence. For a moment, I swore I heard a soft sigh ripple through the trees, a breath of relief, or perhaps a final farewell. In the days and weeks that followed, the cabin's atmosphere shifted in subtle ways. The oppressive weight I'd felt, the sense that invisible eyes were watching my every move, lightened. My nights were less troubled by strange noises, and I found myself slipping more easily into a restorative sleep. Sometimes, late at night, I still sensed a presence, but it felt gentler now, more akin to a guardian spirit than a haunting. I began writing with renewed vigor, crafting short stories and poems that explored themes of lost love, the passage of time, and the enduring resonance of memory. My words flowed more freely than they ever had in the city, as though the sorrow of Charles and Eleanor had unlocked a depth of empathy within me, a channel I'd once kept hidden behind the clamor of urban life. Local folks began to notice my willingness to engage with the land's history and sorrow. Some would stop by with old family photos or rumors of other stories from these hills, asking if I would write them down, preserve them in some way. I became a sort of collector of half-forgotten tales, cottage superstitions, fireside legends, and the quiet tragedies that had woven themselves into the Berkshire tapestry. Yet, in each story, I felt a distinct echo of the same theme: how easily human lives could be shaped by forces beyond their control, societal pressures, family feuds, or simply the inexorable flow of time. During my solitary walks in the woods, I still occasionally caught glimpses of something in my peripheral vision, a quick flash of movement, a figure drifting between the trunks. Instead of recoiling in fear, I found myself smiling. Maybe it was Eleanor, or Charles, or both, freed from the despair that once tethered them. Maybe they were simply curious now, content to roam as gentle spirits no longer bound by grief. I couldn't say for certain, but the sense of menace was gone, replaced by a solemn serenity that felt more like acceptance than torment. On quieter evenings, I'd settle by the fireplace, a single lamp illuminating my makeshift desk as I poured my heart onto the pages of my notebook. My stories became more layered, reflecting not just my personal experiences, but also the echoes of the letters and local histories I'd immersed myself in. Each piece I wrote felt like a small act of gratitude to this land that had embraced me, sorrow and all. I would not say the cabin is free from all mysteries or occasional eeriness. I still hear the wind groan through the eaves, and the floorboards creak in a way that sometimes sounds like distant footsteps. But these sounds no longer fill me with dread. They remind me of the layers of history beneath my feet, the countless narratives that shaped these hills. I've come to see that the quiet I craved is not an empty silence, but a living, breathing presence, a tapestry of stories both joyous and sad, woven together through generations. Sometimes, as I sit beneath the stars, watching the moonlight skim the dark silhouettes of the trees, I think about Charles and Eleanor. I imagine them hand in hand, wandering a forest path or watching the sunrise from a hidden clearing, a reunion that might exist only in my mind, or perhaps in the intangible realm where memories find new life. In acknowledging their story, I've learned something profound about my own. Heartbreak doesn't vanish the moment we run away. It lingers until we face it fully, allowing empathy to transform our wounds into a deeper understanding of life's fragile beauty. I am Samantha Rivers, Sam, a writer who once sought silence in a small Berkshire's cabin, only to discover that true quiet is never devoid of echoes from the past. The day I found those hidden letters changed me, for it reminded me that we are all bound by the stories we inherit, by loves that ended too soon, by hopes that outlast their mortal forms. If there's any solace to be found, it's in the act of witnessing, bearing gentle testimony to the lost voices that yearn to be heard. And in doing so, I've learned that healing arrives not through isolation, but through connection, even if that connection reaches across centuries and into the realm of spirits. The Berkshires remain a tapestry of gentle hills and hidden sorrows, but for me, they are also a place of creation, where echoes of old heartbreak inspire new beginnings. In the silent hush of these woods, in the creak of the porch floor, I can almost hear the promise that every longing, every broken vow, can find a quiet resolution, if only we have the courage to listen. I arrived at the edge of Willamette National Forest with high hopes and an unspoken longing for calm. My name is Eric Dawson, and before I came here, I was a firefighter in a busy city department, a life spent chasing sirens and wrestling flames. But in the wake of a terrible blaze that nearly cost me my life and took the lives of two of my closest friends, I found that the adrenaline rush of the job had soured into something darker. I carried an unbearable weight of guilt that clung to me like smoke. Everywhere I turned, reminders of that final catastrophic fire haunted me. That's why, about a year ago, I cashed in what I could and bought a small plot of land just outside the Willamette National Forest in Oregon. I built a modest cabin, determined to seek some semblance of peace in the gentle hush of the mountains, far from the ringing alarms and the ghostly memories of collapsed buildings. The first few days in my cabin were, ironically, filled with a sense of possibility and healing. My cabin was small, 2 rooms and a loft for sleeping, but it stood sturdy against the wind, a place I'd constructed largely on my own, each board hammered with intention. There was a neat porch overlooking a dense patch of pines, and beyond that, the looming presence of the forest's darker interior. I remember that I'd brought only the essentials: a bed frame, a small stove, tools for repairs, and a few relics from my old life, a faded photo of my friends, a worn badge. I set up a water filtration system in a creek on the north side of the property, rigged a few solar panels for the bare minimum of power, and told myself that in solitude I would finally let my mind rest, free from sirens and the memory of burning beams and howling flame. I hadn't been there more than a week when odd things began to happen. At first, I chalked them up to my own jumpiness. Once a firefighter, always a firefighter, my nerves were primed for signs of danger. One evening, I stepped outside to breathe in the cool pine air and noticed a strange smell, sulfur, acrid and pungent, lingering around the corner of my cabin. I circled the perimeter, convinced that maybe an animal had died, or some chemical reaction was taking place in the soil, but there was nothing that explained the odor. It dissipated after a few minutes, leaving me uneasy and a little embarrassed at how quickly my heart rate had spiked. In the days that followed, I caught the faint smell of sulfur at least 2 more times, usually at dawn or right after sunset, when the forest seemed to hold its breath between light and dark. No footprints, no scorched ground that I could see, just that sharp tang in the air and an uneasy quiet in the pines. The birds, which usually made a morning ruckus, seemed subdued on those sulfur-tainted days, as though the scent signaled a warning even they could sense. Then came the scorch marks. One afternoon, as I was clearing brush for a small garden plot, I noticed odd patterns in the grass behind the cabin. The ground was discolored in patches, as though it had been singed. I knelt down to examine them, expecting maybe fungal rings or some local plant disease. But the grass was brittle, its tips darkened, and the soil beneath it had an almost charred consistency. It looked like the aftermath of a small, controlled fire, yet I knew I hadn't lit any. The more I studied them, the more the shapes of these scorch marks bothered me. They weren't random. They formed a crude semicircle around the back of my property, as if something had moved along, scorching the ground in an arc. At night, I sometimes struggled with nightmares, images of the inferno that had altered my life. Once or twice I woke in a sweat, convinced that I smelled burning timber, but I would bolt upright, only to find my cabin silent and the night air cold. I told myself it was just the trauma resurfacing, that I was seeing ghosts where none existed. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that something in these woods was amiss. I decided to ask around, so I drove into the closest town, a modest cluster of buildings near a logging road, to gather supplies and maybe see if anyone had heard of local sulfur springs or unexplained fires. The people I met were friendly enough, if a bit reticent about anything unusual in the forest. I talked to a shop owner named Grace, who sold me some groceries and a few hardware items. When I mentioned the scorch marks, her expression turned guarded. She shrugged, telling me that nature could be strange in these parts, that maybe I was seeing the aftermath of a small ground fire caused by lightning. Yet the subtle wariness in her eyes told me there might be more to it. I prodded gently, asking if there were any old stories about the Willamette Forest I should know. Grace hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening, then lowered her voice. "You might want to talk to a man named Russ," she said. "He lives further up the logging road. Used to do a lot of research on the local history. Some say he's got a mind full of tall tales, but if you're seeing strange burns, he might have a story." I followed her advice and tracked Russ down a few days later. He lived in a ramshackle house surrounded by stacks of firewood and rusted equipment, an old dog lazing on the porch. He was a wiry man with deep-set eyes, and when I arrived, he eyed me suspiciously but offered me a seat. Over an hour or so, I told him about the scorch marks, the sulfur odor, my general unease. Slowly, his demeanor shifted from wary to concerned. He began telling me of local legends, stories of a settler who'd been wronged by the local community generations ago, forced off his land under accusations of wrongdoing that, according to rumor, were unfounded. Driven out to the forest, he allegedly met a gruesome end in a remote canyon. Russ said some folks believed this settler's spirit lingered in the forest, particularly around areas where he might have tried to build a homestead. "They say," Russ muttered, "his anger was so strong it burned into the land. Sulfur smell, scorch marks. Maybe it's just old superstition. But I've heard enough stories to give me pause." I thanked Russ for his time, unsure whether to believe in such a tale. Yet the details aligned too neatly with what I'd seen and smelled to ignore. Maybe it was all an elaborate piece of folklore, but it gnawed at me that the scorch marks formed a sort of boundary around my property, as if something was marking its territory. I returned to my cabin, determined to keep an open mind without succumbing to panic. After all, I was a man of practicality. I'd faced real fires, real danger, and the idea of a vengeful spirit sounded like something pulled from a cheap horror novel. But the scorch marks were real enough, and so was the smell of sulfur. And my instincts, the ones honed in firefighting, told me that I was in the presence of something I couldn't easily explain. As the weeks wore on, more bizarre occurrences piled up. On certain nights, I woke to faint sounds outside, a crackling like small flames dancing. Yet when I checked, the land was dark and still. My solar panels began malfunctioning at odd intervals, their wiring inexplicably singed. I found lines of burned grass creeping closer to the cabin, as if each night the scorched boundary inched in. A suffocating sense of dread grew inside me. I'd fought real blazes that devoured buildings in minutes, but never had I felt so powerless. It was as though some invisible fire prowled the forest, flickering at the corners of my reality, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. My mental state worsened, burdened by nightmares of the old inferno that had claimed my friends. Night after night, I'd see their faces in my dreams, contorted in pain, the flames roaring around them. I could almost feel the heat on my skin, taste the ash in my mouth, yet the instant I woke, it was that cold, sulfuric smell greeting me. It took all my willpower not to pack up and run, but pride or stubbornness kept me rooted. I'd come here to heal, damn it. I wouldn't let a few scorch marks drive me away. Still, the tension was relentless, like living beneath a constant threat that I couldn't quite see or extinguish. Eventually, I reached out to Russ again, explaining how the scorch marks were moving closer, how I sometimes heard crackles in the dark. His eyes darkened, and he suggested we consult a local spiritualist, an old friend of his named Mora, who lived about 10 miles away, deeper into the forest. Mora was known for her folk remedies and deep respect for indigenous traditions. "She's done cleansings and purifications in the past," Russ said. Though skeptical, I realized my practical methods had failed. I had no leads, no evidence of a natural phenomenon that made sense. So I agreed to meet Mora, if only out of desperation. The night we drove out to her place, I felt an anxious anticipation akin to stepping off a fire truck into a blazing building. Mora turned out to be a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that held a calm determination. After listening to my account, she studied me for a moment. "The land sometimes carries deep wounds," she said, her voice gentle. "If this settler was truly wronged, his anger might linger, manifesting as an elemental force, fire, brimstone. We can attempt a purification ritual, but I must warn you, confronting such energies can be dangerous." Despite my lingering skepticism, I found myself nodding. Better to try something, anything, than let the fear fester. Mora spent the next day gathering supplies, water from a sacred spring, white sage, and specific herbs said to quell malevolent spirits. I offered to help, though I felt awkward fumbling with items I didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, Russ prepared a small container of ashes from an old cedar tree, explaining that cedar was believed to have protective properties. The plan was to hold a ritual at dusk, combining the elements of fire and water to acknowledge the spirit's pain and, hopefully, invite it to find peace. As a former firefighter, the irony of using fire to combat a spectral inferno wasn't lost on me. That evening, we assembled in a clearing near the southern boundary of my property, where the scorch marks seemed the most pronounced. The sun dipped below the pines, casting long shadows across the burnt patches. A nervous tension crackled in the cool air. Mora directed Russ and me to form a circle around a small pit, where we'd laid a bundle of sage, cedar ashes, and a bowl of the sacred spring water. She lit the sage, and the pungent aroma wafted upward, mixing with the lingering tang of burnt grass. She began to chant softly, words that seemed to straddle the line between English and something older, her voice steady as she called upon the spirit to reveal itself, to accept our offering of rest. For a long, breathless moment, there was only the sound of the breeze in the treetops and the crackle of burning sage. My heart pounded, sweat beading on my brow despite the evening chill. Then, abruptly, a gust of wind rushed through the clearing, so cold it made my bones ache. The sage fire flared, sparks dancing into the dark sky. Mora continued chanting, though her voice wavered slightly, and I felt a rush of adrenaline, reminiscent of stepping into a fire, not knowing if I'd make it out whole. Something in the darkness hissed. That's the only word I can use. Hissed, like a release of steam, followed by the sharp odor of sulfur that made my eyes sting. Russ muttered a curse under his breath, gripping his flashlight, though he kept it off for fear of dispelling the ritual's atmosphere. My mouth went dry as I caught sight of movement at the perimeter of our clearing. It was like a shimmer of heat mirage, but in the faint moonlight, it took a vaguely human shape. I instinctively took a step back, fighting the urge to run. Mora's voice rose, commanding the spirit to heed us, to let go of its rage. She lifted the bowl of spring water, sprinkling droplets across the scorched grass. At first, the effect was subtle. The water hissed on contact, little puffs of steam rising from the ground. But then the temperature seemed to plummet further, and the shape in the darkness flickered as if in pain. I felt a pang of pity, imagining a settler's soul trapped in an endless cycle of fury and torment. The shape twisted, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I saw the outline of a man's face, contorted in anguish. Then everything went sideways. A sudden roar filled the night, louder than any forest animal I'd ever heard. A guttural shriek that rattled my teeth. The circle of scorched ground erupted in tiny flames, blue-white flickers that danced like tormented ghosts across the clearing. Mora cried out, flinging the rest of the water at the flames, but they only sputtered and flared again. The wind whipped around us, swirling dust and sparks. My fight-or-flight response screamed at me to do something, but I was paralyzed with shock. Russ tried to speak, to shout instructions maybe, but I couldn't make out his words over the deafening howl. It felt as if the entire forest was caught in a vortex of rage. In a surge of old firefighting instinct, I grabbed a shovel and tried to stamp out the flames, but the ground burned my boots, and the heat radiating up felt otherworldly, not like any normal fire I'd battled. Even as I stomped, the flames slithered across the grass in arcs, forming shapes that defied logic. The air thickened with sulfur fumes, my eyes watering, my lungs burning. In the corner of my vision, the shape in the darkness loomed larger, a silhouette flickering with an eerie glow, as if it were fueling the inferno with its very essence. I'm not sure how long the chaos lasted, maybe minutes, maybe seconds. Eventually, Mora found the strength to continue chanting, her voice strained but unwavering. She flung cedar ashes into the flames, and Russ threw the remainder of the sacred water. There was a final, ear-splitting wail, and then the flames extinguished in a sudden, violent flash. The wind died as quickly as it had come. Silence blanketed the clearing. I stood there trembling, my shovel in hand, staring at the blackened earth. A few smoldering embers winked out near my boots. My heart thudded against my ribcage, my thoughts a jumble of disbelief and awe. The shape, the presence, whatever it was, had vanished into the night. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest that we had succeeded, but a single glance at Mora's pale, shaken face told me otherwise. The ritual hadn't banished the spirit, not fully. Perhaps it wounded or startled it, but the overwhelming malevolence in that clearing had not felt like something appeased or resolved. It felt more like a partial victory at best, or worse, a provocation that might stir even greater wrath. I realized, with a sinking dread, that I was out of my depth. As a firefighter, I knew when a blaze was beyond my capacity, and this phenomenon, this unearthly, vengeful force, was no blaze I could quench with water or foam. We left the clearing in a daze, returning to the cabin to gather ourselves. My hair and clothes smelled of sulfur, and my boots had patches of melted rubber near the soles. None of us spoke much, though Russ patted me on the back, something akin to an apology in his eyes. Mora looked heartbroken, as if she blamed herself for leading the ritual into a confrontation we couldn't control. I offered them both my thanks, hollow as it felt, because they'd tried to help me in ways few others would have. But in the silence that followed, we all understood that the land was too deeply scarred by this ancient anger, and that my presence here had stirred it awake. That night, I slept only in brief snatches, every shift of shadow sending a spike of adrenaline through my veins. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I stood on my porch, staring out at the line of pines, and something told me I couldn't remain. I'd come here seeking healing from my own traumatic past, yet I had stumbled into a haunting that reopened my deepest fears. In all my firefighting days, I had faced raging infernos that threatened entire neighborhoods, but never had I encountered a force so personal, so intangible, and so full of relentless malice. The irony didn't escape me. I, a man who once lived to battle flames, was retreating from a fire I couldn't fight. So I did what I had to do. I packed my belongings into my truck, stowing away the few precious items that had survived my old life. I took one last walk around the property, noting how the scorch marks seemed to intensify in places. Even in the morning light, the ground looked as though it had been seared by invisible embers. The smell of sulfur clung to the air, as if offering one final warning. I looked at the cabin, a place I'd built with my own hands, dreaming of peace, and felt a quiet pang of regret. But I knew staying longer might invite something far worse than regret. I drove away as the sun rose over the eastern ridges, my gaze lingering on the forest in the rearview mirror. I left behind the fractured dream of solitude, acknowledging that some battles are not mine to win. A mixture of shame and relief coiled in my chest. Shame that I was fleeing yet another tragedy. Relief that that I might still save myself from a fate I could barely comprehend. I told myself I would find another way to heal from the ghosts of my past, a place untainted by the echoes of injustice that once festered here. Weeks have passed since I departed. I've rented a small apartment in a neighboring county, close enough to the mountains that I can still see their silhouettes on the horizon. Sometimes, while driving or drifting into a light doze, I think I catch a whiff of sulfur in the wind, or see the faint outline of scorched earth in a patch of grass, and my chest tightens. In these moments, I remind myself that some wounds, both personal and tied to the land, run too deep to be mended by mere good intentions or rituals. I have no plans to return to the cabin. I'm not sure what will become of it. Maybe it will stand empty, its porch creaking in the cold mountain nights, or maybe some braver soul than I will attempt to reclaim it. All I know is that the specter of that wronged settler, his furious presence dancing like a flame beyond reason, remains seared into my memory, a sobering lesson in the power of unresolved anger. I've faced many fires, but none as haunting and unquenchable as the one that prowls the Willamette National Forest, forever fueled by a spirit's ancient pain. I wish I could say I found neat closure, a tidy explanation for each burn mark and wisp of sulfur. But life doesn't always grant such endings. Instead, I move forward with the humility that comes from knowing I stood face to face with something beyond my control. A darkness older than my own tragedy, older than the nightmares that once defined me. In a way, it's humbling, a reminder that we humans are guests in these vast wilds, guests who might stir forces we cannot hope to understand. For now, I choose to keep walking, carrying the lessons learned and the memory of searing flames that no firefighter's hose could ever extinguish. I left behind the restless sprawl of Atlanta in search of something simpler, something that would let me breathe again, far from the constant sirens and the haze of neon lights. My name is Alicia Rivera, and for as long as I can remember, I'd carried an unrelenting desire to live off the land, to tread lightly upon the earth. I thought if I could just find a corner of the world removed from the frantic pace of city life, I might finally achieve the peace that always seemed to slip through my fingers. That's how I ended up in the Florida Panhandle, a region with miles of pine forests, winding bayous, and a muggy subtropical climate that made the air cling to my skin like a warm embrace. I found a small cabin near the edge of Apalachicola National Forest, not too far from the banks of the Ochlockonee River. It was humble, a single-story structure perched on cinder blocks with a rickety porch that groaned underfoot. A friend of mine from a local sustainable living group told me about it. The previous owner had started to renovate but given up halfway, leaving behind battered walls and half-installed solar panels. I saw opportunity in that. I believed my knack for problem-solving and thirst for living sustainably would turn this forlorn cabin into a haven of self-sufficiency. So I used most of my savings, packed a pickup truck with my meager possessions, and headed south, buoyed by a mixture of excitement and determination. The first time I drove down the sandy road that led to the cabin, I felt an electric thrill. Towering slash pines rose on either side, and palmetto fronds rustled in the undergrowth. The sky seemed wider, painted in pastel hues at dusk, and the call of crickets filled the early twilight. The cabin itself was set back from a narrow dirt lane, surrounded by tall grasses and the occasional cypress tree that hinted at the wetlands beyond. I remember stepping onto the porch, letting the sultry air envelop me, and telling myself that this was it, my new start, my chance to prove that living sustainably off-grid wasn't just a pipe dream, but a tangible choice that could anchor me to the land. The first few weeks were brimming with the usual challenges of an off-grid lifestyle, repairing the half-finished solar setup, digging a composting pit, figuring out how to collect enough rainwater to last through the scorching months. I tackled each problem methodically, my t-shirt clinging to me in the Florida heat, hands calloused and sweaty from hours of hammering and digging. Yet, as tough as the labor was, I felt a glimmer of pride each time I saw the solar panels start storing energy, or heard the trickle of water flowing into the makeshift cistern I'd rigged up. It felt like progress, a reaffirmation that I could thrive on my own terms. But the land had its own rhythms, and it wasn't long before I realized something was off. One evening, as the sun bled pink across the horizon, I heard a low, mournful moan drifting across the cypress stands. My first thought was that it might be an injured animal, maybe a deer or even an alligator, but the sound was too sustained, too mournful, carrying a note of desperation that sent chills across my damp skin. The next time I heard it was at dusk a few days later, while I was hauling a load of lumber to shore up the back walls of the cabin. There it was again, low, drawn out, echoing from somewhere along the bayou. I dropped my load of boards and walked out behind the cabin, scanning the tree line with a growing sense of unease. The pines and cypress cast long shadows, the thick underbrush unmoving, yet that moan lingered in the humid air, as if searching for an ear to hear its sorrow. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed odd patterns in the local wildlife. The raccoons and opossums that often rummaged around at night seemed scarce, as if driven off or spooked by something. Even the birds seemed uneasy. On certain mornings, the forest around me was eerily still, lacking the usual chorus of songbirds that I'd come to expect at dawn. I started waking up in the early hours, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard footsteps sloshing in the nearby wetlands. I'd rush outside with a flashlight, only to find the night thick with insects and a faint swirl of fog. No sign of an intruder. It reached a point where I couldn't dismiss these incidents as mere coincidences or local wildlife quirks. I decided to talk to some of the residents in the nearest town, Sopchoppy, which was about 20 miles away. A quiet community steeped in old Southern traditions. Sopchoppy had a small diner, a post office, and a few shops. Over a mug of sweet tea in the diner, I spoke with folks about the strange moans and the unsettling hush that fell over the woods. Most locals shrugged, offering vague remarks about swamp gas or the typical calls of alligators, but I caught glimpses of uncertainty in their eyes. One older woman, a longtime local, lowered her voice and murmured, "That old bayou's seen more sorrow than you know. There's plenty of restless spirits out there." She wouldn't elaborate, leaving me to wonder about the secrets these swamps held. Then I met Benny, a local fisherman who sometimes guided tours through the Blackwater creeks and cypress groves. Over a conversation by the battered docks near the Ochlockonee River, I mentioned the moans and my concern that something was amiss. Benny listened thoughtfully, chewing on a piece of reed. After a moment, he said there were rumors of an old feud that once gripped this region generations ago, a bitter clash between two families that ended in bloodshed out in the wetlands. According to local legend, the final confrontation occurred near a hidden bayou, not far from where my cabin stood. Benny claimed that ever since, people had reported strange sightings, apparitions gliding across swamp waters, disembodied voices crying out at dusk, and a lingering sense of grief that clung to the cypress knees like Spanish moss. I felt a chill despite the cloying heat. The idea that old tragedy might shape the energy of the land was foreign to my rational mind, but the more I heard, the more I felt pulled into a narrative that defied simple explanation. I had always prided myself on being practical, even scientific in my approach to problem solving. Yet these occurrences, the moans, the uneasy wildlife, the heavy hush at certain hours, didn't fit neatly into any rational box. A small, insistent voice inside me suggested I should keep an open mind, that the land's history might be bleeding into the present in ways I couldn't fully understand. Several nights later, I experienced something that shattered the last bit of skepticism I'd been clinging to. I was out near the orchard I planned to plant. Just a small clearing with a few saplings. The moon was bright, flooding the clearing with silver light. I'd gone out to check on the protective netting around my young trees. As I knelt by the saplings, I caught a flicker of motion at the tree line. My pulse spiked. I remained still, forcing my eyes to adjust. Then, in the ghostly moonlight, I saw a shape, tall, indistinct, and gliding rather than walking. It slipped between the cypress in slow, fluid movements. I froze, heart hammering, as the shape vanished behind a tree, then reappeared on the other side, as if drifting in and out of the physical world. A soft, moaning sound accompanied it, the same tone I'd been hearing for weeks. My gut clenched. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice trembling. No answer. The shape paused, turning in my direction, and though I couldn't discern any features, I felt a wave of sorrow or despair emanate from it, as if it were pouring centuries of unresolved grief into the humid night. Then it faded, gliding backward into the deeper shadows. I stayed there for a long moment, every instinct telling me to run back to the cabin. Eventually, I found the strength to stand and hurry away, but the memory of that shape lodged in my mind, refusing to be easily banished. Over the next few days, I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of me insisted this was some trick of moonlight, a silhouette cast by swaying branches. Yet the intensity of that feeling, heartache, regret, lingered, defying my attempts at rational explanation. I found myself increasingly on edge, losing the sense of safety I'd worked so hard to cultivate. Desperate for answers, I asked around about local spiritual traditions. That's when I heard mention of a Cajun mystic named Henrietta, who lived about an hour's drive from my cabin, near a cluster of stilt houses that dotted the wetlands. People whispered that she was well versed in the old ways, able to sense the currents of spirit that moved through the bayous. They also warned me she was guarded, reluctant to share her knowledge unless she believed your cause was just. I was half embarrassed seeking her out, but the combination of dread and curiosity propelled me forward. Finding Henrietta's place was an adventure in itself. I drove along a rutted dirt road that narrowed until it was practically swallowed by cypress trees dripping with Spanish moss. Eventually, I came upon a small shack perched on stilts, connected to a larger dwelling via a raised walkway. Brightly colored wind chimes hung from the eaves, tinkling in the swampy breeze. I climbed the steps, calling out a greeting, uncertain if I was welcome. A woman with sharp eyes and gray hair braided neatly down her back opened the door. Without a word, she fixed me with an assessing gaze. Then, as if discerning my sincerity, she invited me in. We sat at a wooden table inside a cluttered but cozy room, the air thick with the aroma of herbs and dried flowers. I recounted the moans, the shape I'd seen, the uneasy hush of the forest. Henrietta listened, her expression grave yet sympathetic. She then told me what she knew of the old feud that had scarred the land. She spoke of two families, the Laveau and the Duvalier, locked in a cycle of vengeance that culminated in a catastrophic clash in the wetlands. According to local lore, a child from one family drowned during the chaos, and an elder from the other family vanished without a trace. The violence left a stain on the bayou, fueling tales of restless spirits who roamed the area, wailing their lamentations. Henrietta explained that if the sorrow was strong enough, it could take on a life of its own, affecting the wildlife, the vegetation, and even the people who lived nearby. She believed I might have unwittingly settled right where the energy of that feud was most concentrated. When I asked if there was a way to quell the haunting presence, her eyes flickered with caution. "We can try a cleansing ritual," she said softly, "but the land's pain runs deep. You must be prepared for the possibility that it won't be enough." Despite her warning, I agreed to attempt the ritual. My off-grid cabin was supposed to be a testament to sustainable living, a place of harmony with nature, not a stage for old resentments from a bygone era. So, one early evening, Henrietta joined me at my property. She brought a small pouch of herbs and a bundle of dried cane, as well as a battered old book that looked like a family heirloom. We walked to a clearing near the bayou's edge, the sun dipping low over the cypress knees as insects hummed a steady chorus. The air felt charged, like it did sometimes right before a Florida thunderstorm. Henrietta lit the bundle of herbs and cane, letting thick, fragrant smoke curl around us. She prayed in a hushed tone, mixing French phrases with what I assumed was Creole, asking the spirits of the land for peace. I stood beside her, clutching a battered photo from my old life, a symbol of my own desire to move forward without being chained to the past. Step by step, we circled the clearing, sprinkling a mixture of salt and crushed shells, an offering of renewal. I felt a growing tension, as though the very air bristled with anticipation. At the moment we finished our circle, a sudden, suffocating silence fell. The insects stopped humming. The wind died. Then we heard it, that long, mournful moan, louder than ever, rising from the direction of the bayou. My heart thundered. Henrietta gripped my arm, whispering to keep steady. She raised the burning herbs aloft, chanting something I couldn't understand, her voice quivering with urgency. That's when the figure emerged from the tree line, a dark silhouette floating just above the water's edge. Even in the dim light, I recognized the shape I'd seen under the moonlit orchard. It drifted closer, though not in a way that suggested aggression. Its presence emanated sorrow, an ancient heartbreak that made tears well in my eyes. Henrietta's chanting grew more fervent. She sprinkled the mixture of salt and shells toward the figure, imploring it to find rest. At first, the figure hesitated, shifting as though uncertain. Then a gust of wind came from nowhere, swirling debris around us. The flame at the tip of Henrietta's herb bundle danced wildly, threatening to go out. The figure let out a cry, an inhuman wail that resonated deep in my gut. It felt as though centuries of grief and anger poured out in that sound, rattling my senses. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with both fear and empathy. Then, just as quickly as it had arisen, the wind died, the cry fading into a ragged whisper. The figure receded, drifting back into the gloom of the cypress swamp. The hush returned, laden with an uneasy tension. My limbs shook, sweat pouring down my face. I glanced at Henrietta, who looked equally shaken. "I don't know if it's done," she said quietly. "We gave it an opening to release some of the pain, but it's stubborn, deeply rooted." In the following days, the oppressive moans diminished slightly, but the sense of lurking sorrow remained. I found that my nights were still troubled by fleeting shadows, and the knowledge that the bayou was far from at peace. I tried to press on, continuing my off-grid projects, but a knot of fear and sadness coiled in my stomach each time the sun sank behind the tall pines. Though the frantic moaning had become less frequent, it was replaced by a quieter, more pervasive sadness in the air, as if the feud's ghosts were still deciding whether to accept or reject our attempts at reconciliation. Then came the night that finally pushed me to a decision I dreaded. A fierce summer thunderstorm rolled in off the Gulf, lashing the forest with wind and torrential rain. I huddled inside the cabin, lighting candles when the solar power failed. Thunder boomed overhead, rattling the windows, and in the spaces between the thunderclaps, I heard it, the moan, now weaving through the roar of the storm. I peered outside, the candlelight flickering across my anxious face. Through the deluge, I spotted that same silhouette near the orchard, illuminated by a flash of lightning. It writhed, as if caught in an agony no storm could wash away. The sight made my blood run cold. Another lightning flash revealed the figure's arm outstretched toward me, beckoning or blaming. I couldn't be sure. The wind hurled rain against the walls, and water seeped under the door. In the hammering sheets of rain, I sensed the presence drawing closer, as if the tempest had awakened a darker power. The cabin walls creaked ominously, and a sudden impact jolted me, a tree limb, or something else. My rational mind screamed that I was in danger, not from the storm alone, but from the unresolved specters that inhabited this land. In that moment, fear crystallized into certainty. I could not remain. All my devotion to sustainable living, all my pride in forging a simple life, none of it mattered if each night brought me closer to a terror that thrived on heartbreak and resentment older than my own existence. When the storm eased at dawn, I wasted no time. I threw essentials into my truck, hands trembling as I prayed the muddy track wouldn't be impassable. I hardly spared a glance for the orchard I'd hoped to grow, or the solar panels I'd spent countless hours tinkering with. My heart pounded with the regret of leaving behind a dream, but also with the knowledge that I might be preserving my sanity and possibly my life. As I pulled away, the sky cleared, revealing cypress draped in pale morning light. I glimpsed the orchard on the periphery, a few bent saplings battered by wind and rain. I thought of the figure, that unearthly shape calling out in sorrow, and felt a hollow ache in my chest. I drove north, the tension in my shoulders gradually easing the farther I got from the cabin. When the paved highways finally appeared, and the Panhandle's thick forests yielded to more populous areas, I felt both relief and grief in equal measure. Relief that the nightly torment and creeping dread were behind me, at least for now, and grief that the land's old wounds remained unhealed, and that my dream of an off-grid paradise had shattered under the weight of a haunting older than any conflict I'd known. I've since rented a small place in Tallahassee, where the rhythm of daily life offers a kind of comfort. Yet, I still wake at odd hours, half expecting to hear that plaintive moan floating through the humid air. I can't help but wonder if the spirit in the bayou remains, drifting between cypress knees, lamenting a tragedy that time refuses to bury. Sometimes I toy with the notion of returning for just one day, to see if Henrietta might have succeeded in further easing that unsettled presence. But then I recall the storm's wrath, the silhouette beckoning through the lightning, and my resolve to protect myself and let go of a battle I can't win revives. I am Alicia Rivera, a woman who sought a simpler life in the lush heart of the Florida Panhandle, only to discover that the land carried a grief that overshadowed my hopeful plans. I came with a desire to live sustainably, to honor the environment by walking lightly upon it. Instead, I stumbled into a realm where ancient grudges weighed as heavily as the humid air, whispering ghost stories among the gnarled cypress and winding bayous. Part of me believes the sorrow clinging to that cabin predates human understanding, shaped by the collective heartbreak of the families who once fought and died there. Someday, I hope that region finds its absolution, that the spirits who mourn can finally rest, and that the living can inhabit the land without fear. For now, I carry away lessons I didn't anticipate learning, that the environment isn't just soil and water and sky, but also the memories we imprint upon it, for better or worse. And though I had to abandon my dream of an off-grid haven, I remain committed to living sustainably wherever I land next, only now with a deeper humility, knowing that the Earth's past holds mysteries and sadness that can rise without warning, reminding us that harmony with the land isn't always ours to command. I move forward, still longing for a home that resonates with peace rather than old battles, but also grateful for the cautionary wisdom that echoes through my memories of a lonely cabin in the bayou, haunted by moans of a sorrow that refused to stay buried.